Oke, Pak.
Cek apakah suara saya terdengar?
Terdengar jelas, Hans.
Oh ya, siap. Saya izin share screen dulu ya.
Oke.
Sudah terlihat ya?
Ya, terlihat.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Hans. I'll be one of the CEP member as well for this year's NUDC's 2023 alongside with Batara. We will bring to you the judge briefing in regards of what is judge basically in debate, how judge operate, and what you need to know as a judge in general. So this will be the outline or the agenda for this presentation. Firstly, I'll explain in regards of the general guidelines, online sharing, roles of educator. Then Batara will proceed on explaining the common mistakes, so on and so forth, until the point of oral adjudication later on. So it will mainly discuss this main outline. I hope that everyone here, not only the judges that will participate in the tournament, but also the debaters, please pay attention to this presentation and seminar, because understanding that judging process also impact how debaters score their judges and to some extent strategize probably their position, knowing of what judges actually looking for in a content or in an argument. So it's quite important for both debater and judges to pay attention to this presentation or seminar. So firstly is the general guideline. We will have three types of adjudicator in NUDC. First is chair, second is panelist or wing, third is trainee. Now, these roles actually imply what the role of judges inside of that room. So for example, chair judge is considered to be the most experienced and trusted in the room, especially in terms of leading and moderating discussion among judges. In BP debating, judge will confer with, will deliberate and will discuss among each other to reach a consensus of what is the ranking, like first, second, third, and fourth, so on and so forth. Chair judge in this case will firstly moderate the debate in general, and secondly will lead the discussion when it's already time for judges to discuss regarding the results of the round, for example, in something like that. Hence, most of the time, chair judges are deemed as someone that is trusted to lead the discussion. Second, we have panelists or wing. Panelists is expected to contribute within the discussion, and in this case, have the capacity to vote if it is necessary. So in case of discussion, most of the time it ended up into a unanimous decision, because you confer to each other, you discuss to each other in regards of what should be the decision for this round, or what should be the decision for this debate in specific, and something like that. But in case there is a certain disagreement that unfortunately cannot be resolved from discussion, panelists and chair are the one that is allowed to vote. So the third role that we have in regards of trainee, they are very welcome to contribute toward the discussion, to convince a certain panel or a certain chair in regards of, oh, I think that decision is this way. I think that certain team should be ranked above the other team and something like that. Trainee are allowed to do that. But in case where there is disagreement happen and cannot be resolved from discussion, trainee are not allowed to vote. So they don't have the capacity to vote. So if we conclude, this chair is basically the one that moderate and lead the discussion. Panelists and trainee both contribute into the discussion, try to convince each other or try to listen to each other as well of why the reasons is as what they deem is correct, for example. But in case where there is disagreement and the discussion cannot resolve those disagreement, the one that being allowed to vote is only chair and panelists. Trainee are not allowed to vote. But one thing we need to remind everyone here is that we shouldn't assume one's capability simply based on the assigned role that they have in a certain room. So for example, if you are a chair judge in a certain room, please do not exclude trainee or even panelists from the discussion. Listen to them, because we believe that especially in BP debating, everyone can be contributive, everyone can contribute in a different way toward the discussion. And we believe that those kind of discussion it will be better if there is a participation from all panelists, from all trainees as well. So please include them in the discussion, especially if you are chair that moderate the room, because there are few might change the decision as well to some extent. So we cannot assume one's capability simply by the role that they given. Probably it's just because of experience, probably it's because a certain round the assigned role is in that way. But in every round, judges, please reset your mind. Please remember that you view everyone having an equal capability to contribute in the discussion. Role is just a role. Contributing in the discussion is an obligatory for everyone, and chair judges need to make sure that everyone participate within that discussion. So it's not only for chair, it's also for panelists and trainee. Do not afraid to contribute within the discussion. Do not being discouraged simply because you are not put as chair in a room, for example. You can still contribute inside the discussion as a panelist, as a trainee, even contribute in a large amount of in the decision making can be happen even for those who are trainee, who are panelists, not only the chair. So let's discuss chairing first. So first and foremost, chairing or being a chair in a room means that you, to some extent, also kind of directed, quote unquote, directed the debate. What does it mean by directed the debate? Is that you open the debate by introducing yourself, letting your panels or trainees to introduce themselves as well. Most of the time it's in alphabetical order. So this is what chair do before the debate starts. So after case building time has done, chair usually come to the room and start a quick roll call, for example, like, okay, is opening government here and complete? Is opening opposition here and complete? CG, CO, so on and so forth. And then they introduce themselves. Oh yeah, my name is this, general pronounces this, so on and so forth. Then you ask your panelists and trainee to introduce themselves. Then you ask the speakers in the room to also introduce themselves. What's the name? Who's speaking first? Who's speaking second, for example, in something called line, preferred gender pronouns, POI preference in case of online debating, especially in the regional tournament. And the reason of why it need to be done is that number one, it's just similar to a quick roll call for judges for introduction from judges themselves, but it is also good for judges to introduce themselves. So debaters are not mispronounced, for example, are not miss the existing judges in the room, for example, and something cross that line. For speakers, it's also important for judges to let them introduce themselves, also mentioning their speaker roles, because remember, judges also need to submit ballot. They also need to submit the score for teams that competing in the room, meaning they need to know who's speaking first, who's speaking second, so the ballot can be as precise as possible. So please make sure if you are chairing in a room, especially judges here who participate as N1, invited, CAP, or something like that, please make sure that you follow these 4 steps of becoming a chair in a room to ensure the smoothness of the tournament, to ensure the smoothness of the debate in general. This will be the roles of adjudicator. What is being an adjudicator means? It means that you are being an average reasonable voters. This means 5 things. Number one, you possess a basic information of things that happened recently in the mainstream media. So for example, you know that there is an escalation of Israeli and Palestinian conflict during Ramadan. You know there's a Paris Agreement for combating climate change. You know there is war between Ukraine and Russia. You know there is Donald Trump's indictment in April 2023. This is something that go through the mainstream media that most of the time average person will consume. It means that this is a basic knowledge that we expect average reasonable person to have, or average reasonable voters. But what is the limit? The limit is you shouldn't use a specific data or knowledge about a certain issues for you to determine the result of a certain role. So for example, if you know the specific process of maybe metal refining, for example, you cannot use that specific knowledge because this is a specific information that you can only get either from reading a specific journal, for example, or reading a very specific news that not average individual or average reasonable voters will likely to consume. So you might know about Donald Trump's indictment in April 2023, you might know about the case, but you probably do not really know the whole detail of how the court eventually, who involved inside of the court and how the defense attorney eventually defend or something cross that line. So you know the problem exists, but you might not know the technicalities inside of the problem that eventually exists. So in case of war, you know that the conflict happened, but you might not know the weaponry that probably being used inside of the war and something like that. So it's something that general people usually know. It exists in mainstream media. If it is too specific, then it's a sign that it is a very specific knowledge that you shouldn't use inside of being an adjudicator. Third is that you're able to exert basic logical question, but you must not step in. So in this case, you are allowed to eventually think, okay, this is the burden that being taken by a certain teams, and teams answer it in this way. Most likely, you will think in that way as an adjudicator. But you cannot, for example, number one, responding to a speaker's argument by yourself. So for example, if a speaker brings an argument that, okay, this will bring the benefit for general society, then you feel that, oh, this argument is not strong enough, because I think that there's a lot of rebuttal that can be taken, hence most of the time this argument is not true or something like that. You cannot do that. You need to observe what is the response inside of the debate and how then that operates within the clashes of a certain argument and something like that. So you cannot just respond by yourself. You really need to see what teams is actually responding to their argument. The same case toward imposing a burden, that if a team take a burden of, okay, we only need to prove that this is bad, and if the motion also imposed in that way, like the earlier seminar by Omar, it means that you need to assess it in that way. You cannot just think, oh yeah, I think there's an important burden that need to be answered in the debate, hence because team doesn't answer this and because a certain team answer this, they win. So you cannot impose by your own view that I think this is the burden that is important, hence team need to answer. You cannot do that. You need to see in specific what happened in the debate. We'll explain it later as well, but this is just for the broad the introduction, that you cannot step in. You must see what happened in the debate, and you must be able to assert the logical questions that exist in a certain argument, which is logical. Which is basic logical question that's not happened because you are stepped in, but basic logical question that happened by the speakers themselves. So you cannot respond to the speakers. You cannot impose a burden that you think is important to be answered. You really need to see, okay, this is the burden being taken by a certain team, how they answer that. You need to see it that way. Fourthly, is that this also means that you are someone that are willing to be persuaded in either side. You cannot impose your own personal belief. So for example, if there's a motion about United States, Republican and Democrat, for example, just because you feel that Democrat probably is more lenient toward your view, you cannot impose that view to make a certain team's win. So you are an average person who are in the middle that are willing to be persuaded by either side of the house. You cannot use your identity. If you are religious, for example, or you are a certain political leaning, for example, you cannot simply persuade it by a certain argument simply because that argument are in line with your personal beliefs. You cannot do that. You need to be average. You need to be willing to be persuaded by either side. And lastly, this is probably some cases that most of the time happen, or most cases actually happen. Adjudicator means that you only judge the debate. What happened means that you cannot be quote unquote a coach in the round. You are not supposed to, okay, I think debate should go in this way, hence that's how I will judge the debate. You cannot do that. What you need to do is observe what happened in the debate and how then a certain team wins the debate based on the debate that happened. It's not that because I think it's supposed to be going in this direction, hence a certain team win. You cannot do that. If you want to give feedback for teams, you can do it after the debate, after the oral adjudication. But the way for assessing the debate should be based on the debate themselves, not based on other metrics that happen, not because of just because of yourself. Okay, that's the role of adjudicator. And this is basically the comparison of what is an ordinary intelligent voter and what is not an ordinary intelligent voter, or what we earlier refer as the average reasonable voter. So firstly is, of course, being open-minded and willing to be convinced. doesn't know technical terms, like what I said earlier, that is very specific from a certain particular degree or something like that, you comes from nowhere, would expect quote unquote local example to be extensively explained as it would be if it's not from the judge's home country. So, for example, if assume that we are from Indonesia, just because a certain team bring an example of Indonesia, that doesn't mean we automatically understand what the teams mean. The debaters need to explain of what is this example means and why does this example eventually relate to the motion. So you cannot put your own logic inside of that example simply because, oh yeah, this is from Indonesia, I know this example. You cannot just impose that, do it yourself and try to make the link by yourself because you know what happened. Debaters need to explain themselves. The same way, if a certain teams probably bring in an example from other country like Philippines, like Malaysia, like Vietnam, for example, most likely average reasonable voters might not really understand what really is the issue that are being talked about if it is too specific. Hence, it is expected as well for judges to treat the similar case even toward the example that you might know specifically, like for example, the example from a specific country, for example, and something like that. Lastly, is about judges' debate as it happens by evaluating the logical flow, as always, to determine who wins the debate based on the argument. Not an ordinary intelligent voters is basically the opposite of all of that. So I think it's quite clear in this case. For judges, I think to some extent judges also need to read this specifically in case that you still doesn't understand what is an ordinary intelligent voter. So if we able to conclude this, basically average reasonable voters, that you are willing to be persuaded, you shouldn't impose your specific knowledge toward how you judge a debate. You need to see how the debate goes, and you cannot impose your own burden toward a certain teams. You cannot impose a certain expectation to a certain team and something like that. So it's really just observing the debate, willing to be persuaded, knowing what general people know and not too specific about that. And this is what we do as a judge. The first thing that we need to prioritize is tracking the debate. Your first job is to listen and take notes. Why we need to take notes? Simply because there's a lot of things that will be said by speakers. And you need to pay attention toward all of that. And you need to compare everything that teams eventually bring out to debate. It is completely fine for judges to reread or recheck their notes once the debate ends, once a certain speeches end. It's completely fine. And we encourage judges to take notes. Because most of the time, we have limitation as a human being. We have limitation of memory. Then we need to eventually take notes upon what is being talked about in debate, what's being taught by certain speakers in the room. And that really helpful for us to really track down, okay, so speaker A bring this, speaker B bring this, so on and so forth. And also help us a lot on, okay, that means this team bring mainly this argument, this team bring this argument, so on and so forth. What things we need to note is that do write what is being explained in the speeches as what they eventually say. We encourage and we highly suggest not to rephrase anything that the speakers say. The reasons of why is because sometimes when you rephrase it, there is a tendency for a certain individual probably to fill in what the speakers eventually say. For example, I think that a certain speaker mean this way. Hence, you write down it that way. That most of the time, that's not the case. Sometimes speakers miss a certain analysis toward reaching that conclusion. Sometimes speakers probably don't really mean it that way. So please refrain from rephrasing what the speaker said, but more on taking the notes exactly what the speaker said. This is also because of language. Probably if it is structured differently, probably means in a different way as well to prevent those misinterpretation of a motion misinterpretation of an argument. Please make sure to take notes verbatimly based on what the speaker says and not rephrasing them. Lastly, is also avoid giving inputs and constructive feedback inside of the note. Remember what I said earlier, that your job here is to be the judge first, not the coach. meaning that if you have any feedback, you can do it later after the round or something like that. You can check your note after the round. But when you are in a round, when you are in a debate, prioritize taking notes, prioritize comparing argument and comparing analysis instead of pointing out, oh, it can be improved in this way or it can be improved in that way. Because to some extent, when you when you prioritize thinking about constructive, most of the time it's also disrupt the purity of the view that you have when you judge or weigh a certain argument between one another, because now you have biases that, oh, these teams miss chances to improve the argument in a certain way, while the other team miss chance in a smaller way or something like that. Where in most cases, that might not be the case for comparing argumentation. Probably team that miss more in terms of their analysis or miss chance or creating bigger harm or benefit can still win above team that might just lose a little bit of things that can be improved. So you really need to just comparing argument and analysis instead of focusing on constructive and feedback. So in conclusion, please make sure to listen, track, write down based on what the speaker said, then prioritize comparing argument, comparing analysis instead of prioritizing constructive and feedback. This is what should be done and what shouldn't be done by a judge when you track the debate. Firstly, please do not, number one, counting argument as the way for you to determine the win. Just because a team bring more argument than the other teams, that doesn't mean they are better. There is a quality inside of a certain argument. There is a quality inside of analysis or layers inside of an argument. So just because a certain team bring more layer, that doesn't mean it will be better in comparative to another team layer. For example, in a motion, this house prefer apple over orange. The teams that bring that defend apple claims that apple is very much beneficial because it's initially accessible, it is nice and tasty, it is good, it is healthy, and something like that. While the teams that bring an argument about orange might not bring that much of analysis, but they bring the analysis. This is just for example, yeah. They're able to prove that when you prefer orange, you're able to eventually improve your intellectuality, you're able to improve your capacity to eventually work in job, for example, or something like that. If we take a look at this, Team A bring more arguments, bring more layer, but Team B only bring one layer. But if we compare in terms of the scale of the impact, it is apparent that the Team B give more scale and give more apparent impact in comparative to the impact that being given out by Team A. So that's just an example to show that just because a team have more argument or more layer, that doesn't mean they always play better than teams that only bring less layer or less argument. Number two, do not give separate score for style, sophistication, and fluency. Remember that your role as judge, especially in DP debating, is that you need to judge, you need to score a certain speakers holistically. That means the combination of style, content, and strategy, or manner, matter, and method. And this means that style, the way that the certain speaker bring out their argument is highly connected in terms of the content. So you need to see the content, then you connect it to style, how then style impacted the content being delivered in certain speakers, then you need to judge it holistically. You cannot separate the score for style simply because you think, oh, the speaker is very fluent. The speaker is very much have a very good American accent or British accent, for example, where the other speaker probably have more local accent or Madura accent, for example, or something like that. You cannot score someone less simply because of their accent, simply because of their fluency. Remember that DP debating, parliamentary debating, prioritize content. We prioritize argumentation, and style is just one of the way for a certain argument to be delivered. So if there's no problem at all in terms of how they deliver a certain argument, you shouldn't just discredit them simply because they stutter, simply because they don't have the fluency that other speakers have. So style is not a separate content, it's not something that is separated from any other scoring analysis that we have. So please make sure to always prioritize what being explained in the scoring bracket later on. Do not score style, sophistication, fluency separately. And the last don't things is that there's no automatic fourth in debate, or no automatic lose, basically. There's no automatic fourth, no automatic third, no automatic second, no automatic first. Why? Just because a certain speaker, for example, speaks for 1 minute, that doesn't mean they will automatically lose. You need to compare what is the content that they brought in the debate and how that operates in the debate as a whole. And that's how you determine a certain team win or lose. Simply because you feel that a certain team being irrelevant, that doesn't mean that they will always lose the debate. Compared to other teams, probably there is a possibility that other team might not be relevant as well. There's a possibility that the irrelevant argument that you think a certain team brings is actually well explained and well framed with the motion. So please do not make your biases come first when you judge. Please make sure that your logical analysis enter how you judge a certain debate rather than your biases or of thinking, oh, there's an automatic force. This is the person, this team should get fourth simply because I feel that it's irrelevant or something like that. You need to compare, you need to see the analysis. You cannot just have a certain biases, oh yeah, because certain thing bring in this way, they'll get fourth. Do not do that. And what you should do as a judge, follow logical flow of the debate, be comparative, bear in mind main point of clashes in the debate, decide which team has provided the most justification and why they should win. So in this case, you compare argumentation, you see what is the clashes that happen in the debate, and what is the main point from those kind of clashes, and why those clashes eventually being weighed in a certain way. Then you decide, okay, this justification from a certain team is the strongest among other team because of multiple weighing, because of multiple comparative. Hence, that's the way you should weigh in terms of why they should win based on the justification that they brought in the debate, based on the argumentation that they brought in the debate. So in conclusion, be comparative. And this is the important notes. Firstly, is that role fulfillment is not a thing anymore, meaning that you shouldn't penalize teams who do not necessarily fulfill their expected roles. So in this case, Prime Minister probably are expected to bring a certain setup to the debate, and that's fine. But you cannot penalize, for example, DPM or Deputy Prime Minister that are expected, quote unquote, to bring extension simply because they do not bring extension. Remember that their speaker roles is no longer role fulfillment is no longer a thing anymore, and it's not something that you should really crucially pay attention to. So if a second speaker only bring a rebuttal, you shouldn't penalize them simply because they bring an extension. The exception, however, is for whip speeches that are already being explained in the speaker role earlier, that probably have certain rules not allowing to really bring a new matter in debate that haven't been explained a lot by the member, for example, or something like that. That is the exception. But role fulfillment, such as, oh, I expect an argument for a certain speaker, or I expect a rebuttal from a certain speaker, is not a thing anymore. DPM or Deputy Leader of Opposition or Deputy Prime Minister can come to the debate and only explain an argument and can still win, and you shouldn't penalize them. Member of government at the same time can come to the debate not bringing extension, but a very good rebuttal toward the opposition bench or for the government bench, and can still win the debate. So please make sure not to determine a certain individual score or ranking simply because the role fulfillment that they have is now have been shifted most of the time in the or what kind of thing that they want to bring out in a certain debate, and that shouldn't be, and that should be something that you see rather than the role fulfillment that they have, just because quote unquote the role that they are assigned to in the debate. Next is time counting and judging based on time. You shouldn't take notes of argumentation that goes beyond the time limit, which is 7 minutes 15 seconds in the buffer time. You shouldn't go, if a speaker go above the time limit, do not count any of that argument. The same goes to POI. If the POI exceed 15 seconds, do not take notes of the POI after that 15 seconds. So please remember that there's time judged based on the time that the speakers are allowed to speak. Simple. Third is always focus on the quality of content, not manner. We have discussed this. And fourthly, there's no differences currently between arguments and rebuttals. In BP, we say it is a a certain theme. So rebuttal can still be counted as an argument as well. Argument can be a rebuttal as well. So it's just contribution instead of it's just a matter of contribution instead of argument and rebuttal separation. And recently, we also have a trend that speakers actually not separate argument and rebuttal. Most of the time, it integrated within one and another. So please make sure not to see argument and rebuttal as something that initially separate anymore. See them as a contribution. So speakers can bring only rebuttal and can still win, can bring only argument and can still win anyway. Next is assessing burden. Simple, the same case earlier, no automatic win or loses. And please remember the relevance of a certain argument with the motion that's specifically being explained earlier in the debate briefing. In the debate briefing, there have been explained, oh, this is an actor motion, this is policy, analysis, regard, refer. Meaning that if it is an actor analysis, there is a specific interest of the actor that you need to explain, that debater need to explain. And judges need to take account into that as well, because this is what burden imposed by the motion themselves. So judges also need to be aware with what is the burden imposed by the motion. This is not stepping in because this is what the motion specifically asks debater to do. Judges need to also see that as well. Meaning that if there's a policy debate, policy execution by the states, that usually done by state, is something that average reasonable voters also have the knowledge upon. The same goes to analysis motion when you judge something that is really good or bad from an outsider perspective, meaning that you need to judge this in that way as well. So for judges, please also remember what the motion type's burden really is, and you need to assess that as well. The second thing that you need to pay attention is also the keyword from the motion. For example, two things. One, this house opposes the hustle culture in workplace. So there is this house opposes, which is the assessing burden from the motion types early on. But there's also hustle culture in the workplace, meaning that what being opposed here is the hustle culture inside of the workplace. That means that is the debate that should happen, hustle culture in the workplace. The same goes, this house will rather prioritize investing, which means that this is not just a debate simply about armament industry versus agriculture industry, but this is discussing about prioritization of investment. So what is implied here is that it is sacrificing a certain investment for a certain sector, but that doesn't mean the other sector doesn't exist. So, for example, prioritizing investing in armament industry, meaning that you prioritize the investment to that. That means there is less investment in agriculture, but that doesn't mean that there is no agriculture sector at all. So please pay attention to the keyword. What does the keyword really means? And that's also how you assess what the motion burden really is. So this is the combination of the motion type. This is also the combination of keyword. So in the first argument, this has opposes, meaning that you judging whether or not hustle culture is good or bad, but hustle culture in the workplace in specific. So please make sure that you also read the keyword so you know what the motion really means as well. This is assessing content. The question that you need to ask yourself when you assess a certain content is that, did the speaker explain the point really well? Was there a logical process explained? Was the significance explained well, or was this just an assertion? Was an actor characterized properly? Were there examples to support the point? So what you need to see here is how then what is the content? Like, okay, the speakers want to argue about A. What is the logical process to reach that? Is it really that significant? Is the actor really think in a certain way, or is really the actor benefited in that way? Where there is a certain example from that as well. So if you see, this is just a combination of what an argument really constituted upon, and you as the judges need to eventually see all of this thing inside of a certain argument. But remember, just because a certain argument doesn't really explain in 5 minutes or 6 minutes, or only being explained within 2 minutes of a speech, that doesn't mean that quality is bad. Airtime doesn't mean quality. There can be a speakers that is very efficient on explaining their argument. Hence, they're able to explain 3 arguments in 5 minutes of speeches and can still have a complete logical process have complete significance, have complete characterization, why the actor benefited or why the actor will behave in a certain way, and still explain a certain example that that being explained the correlation with the motion or with the correlation with the argument. So airtime doesn't always equal to quality. The second is that the more I explain a certain point, the more effort is needed as well to be responded by the opposing teams. This is where comparison, which is the third thing, take into account. If a team explains a certain argument really, really well in the logical processes, in how why actor will behave in a certain way, meaning that the opposing teams need to also respond analysis, need to respond to why a certain actor will not behave in that way, like what a certain teams argue, for example. So if an argument are well explained, well nuances in terms of the logical process and characterization, opposing team need to respond with that as well before they able to eventually rebut or defeat the whole argument from certain teams. So please make sure to see if teams already explain it extensively, is the response is as extensive as the argument that being explained by the speakers. Next is assessing framing. We already assessed content, now is framing. So what is firstly framing? Basically, framing is that, oh, I bring an argument in a certain way, and this is how you should weigh it in comparative to other arguments. So for example, if I bring the argument that, oh yeah, general society will be benefited, and the opposing team explain that, oh, a specific individual will be benefited, the framing is simple. Oh, because we protect more people, then we are more important than the opposing team. That's an example of a framing. And the way that you judges should assess framing is that, number one, is the framing really that important until the point that it make the argument that probably are balanced now become imbalanced, become, oh, the argument from team A is more important because the framing that being explained. So you really need to see that. What is the framing of the team? How then it operated in the argument that now are clashing inside a certain clash or inside the debate. Secondly, do they manage to explain why that framing also beats their opponent? So the teams might try to frame a lot of argumentation, but what's important is that they need to explain why not that framing able to beat their opponent. If teams able to do that, meaning that you should assess framing, you should see, okay, because this framing beats the argument from their opponent, or also beating the framing from their opponent, meaning that we can buy the frame from team government, for example, or team OG, meaning that their argument, or meaning that the framing is buyable. Then you see, what is this framing? The framing is the argument from team government is more important than team opposition. Okay, so that means the way that I assess the framing is that because team government or team OG beat team opposition in terms of why and which framing is more viable, and the framing explained that their argument is more important than anything else in the debate, hence they win the debate. That's the example. And lastly, was there also any logical explanation to support such framing? Remember that framing can be seen similar with the argument in terms of the completion. Just because team explained that, oh yeah, this is our framing, that doesn't mean you always buy that 100%. You need to see, is the framing explained well as well in terms of the logical analysis? So for example, I say that, oh yeah, democracy, people voices is good because people should have the right. That's it. Is that a good framing? Probably not, because there's not much analysis in terms of why then the freedom from people in general should always be the priority in comparative to another types of right, for example, or something like that. So you need to really assess, is the framing really already being explained, or is it just another assertion? Is it just another unexplained framing from a certain team? So there's need to be a logical explanation as well on why that framing is true and why that framing is important in the debate. So it means that when you assess framing, do not hesitate to give credit for teams who manage to help you understanding the key metrics to use in the debate, especially from the framing themselves. Next is assessing responses. Similar to what I said earlier, the first thing that you need to see is that you need to always compare between teams, meaning that if you keep on tracking toward the responses of a certain speakers, there's a certain thing that might happen. What really responses or engagement in this case do in a debate? There's 4 things. Number 1, it might do nothing. If a certain speakers respond a certain argument, but it missed the point from a certain speakers, that doesn't make the arguments false. It doesn't really impact anything toward the argument from opposing teams. So for example, if my argument is that apple is good because it is healthy, then the response is that, oh yeah, apple is hard to get because it's being grown in a very specific region. It doesn't really engage toward the argument that I explained in terms of health, right? Meaning that there's no much things that being done from that responses toward my arguments. That's the first thing that can happen. The second thing, it can give a certain doubt for the argument. So for example, apple is healthy. Then the response is like, oh no, apple might not be healthy. But that's it. So both teams claim that, okay, it is healthy. The other team claims that it is not healthy. And if assuming there's an equal analysis from both teams, this gives a certain doubt. Maybe it's not true that apple is healthy, but we are not sure because both teams doesn't really give more analysis in terms of that. So it's just giving a doubt. There's possibility, but there's no much thing that can be happening from there. It's just giving a certain doubt. That doesn't mean that the argument from a certain team now fall because of that doubt. So remember that doubt is probably just, okay, I doubt that this argument is true, but that's just a doubt. Most of the analysis can still be considered as true from team government, for example. The third thing, it can mitigate the argument. So for example, if I explain that, oh yeah, apple is delicious, then the opposing team explain in a certain way that, okay, apple is not delicious because A, B, C, D, and E, for example. But the analysis is only like, okay, apple might not be that delicious, but it's still delicious. That is a mitigation inside of the argument. So if a team responds to the other team simply by to the way that, okay, it might not be that way, there's a certain things that might prevent your argument to be true. It might mitigate the argument to be true, but that doesn't mean it's completely destroyed. But the last thing that can happen is that it completely destroys the argument. So for example, I said that, okay, I like apple because apple is accessible. The way that team opposition come to debate and explain, number 1, apple is not accessible because it's grown in a very specific region, for example. Number 2, now there's an increasing prices and now it's become more expensive. Number 3, the one that really enjoy eating apple most of the time is only those who are working out, for example, and not in general society or something like that. That's not only giving a lot of doubt, but now the analysis from the opposing team in terms of the responses, far larger in comparative the analysis from team government that only explain that, yeah, apple is accessible. That's it. You can find it in the supermarket. That's it. That not only giving a doubt, but it's completely destroying the argument because the analysis is not only touches the characterization that is not being explained well by team government. For example, in terms of price, team government never explained in terms of price. Team opposition explained when then the price is now inaccessible, explaining who are most likely the individual that want to consume apple, for example, something like that. Make it more convincing from opposition, hence making the argument from team government are being destroyed in this case. Thirdly, is that team shouldn't be penalized for not responding an argument. Remember that response and argument now are integrated between each other and it can be counted as a contribution. So that doesn't mean that you should penalize a certain team simply because of not responding. See their argument as well, how then it operates with the argument that being brought by the other teams. That's how you judge it. And lastly, remember that diagonal engagements actually matters. Diagonal in this case means opening government and closing opposition, closing government and opening opposition. So the diagonal of the opening and closing teams. So if OG, that means the diagonal is CO, CG, the diagonal is OO. In this case, because in DP debating, most of the time opening cannot respond to a closing, hence diagonal engagement really matter in this case. POI is one of the way for you to assess diagonal engagement in terms of, okay, how then OG should respond to CO, it usually comes from POI. How then OG should rebut or should respond to CO, might also come from POI because CO-POI, their argument, for example. But that also means that closing team, in this case, closing government, closing opposition, you need to also see the engagement from them toward the opening team, from closing opposition to opening government, for example, or from closing government to opening opposition. See how then they engage with the argument that already being explained by opening opposition. And please make sure that you also pay attention to POI, because we do understand it might get tricky to some extent when you compare diagonal engagement. But for it to be safe, just remember to always compare, to always assess how POI operate between teams as well. Next is assessing POI. And this is where what I said earlier become important. Not taking POI or dismissing a POI can be the reasons a final call to be made, especially in a close call. So for example, if there is very small tipping point for opening government and closing opposition to be weighed above each other, but CO, for example, reject all the POI from OG, while OG accept the POI from CO and able to respond it well. In this case, in a very, very, very close call, it can be the determining factor where CO can be deemed as not responsive toward OG because they reject and dismiss a lot of POI from opening government in case of a very, very, very close call. So remember that this shouldn't be the main reason all the time, but in a very specific, in a very close call, it can be the reasons of my team being deemed as less responsive in comparative to the other team, especially diagonal engagement. And lastly, chair, please remind speakers to engage in POI, to accept POI to over POI. Next is assessing extension. This is mainly not only for closing, but also for deputies. Extension is a new string of an argument, any line of argumentation, any continuation from the argumentation as well. But it might have different content, different extent of elaboration, different conclusion, different context, different example, or different responses. So extension doesn't really always mean originality. It doesn't really mean that, oh yeah, because opening team already brought about principle of participation. That doesn't mean that closing cannot draw principle of participation. It can still, closing team can still argue in terms of participation, but they might have different extent of elaboration. They might explain, for example, if opening team explain a participation in, oh yeah, why participation is good, closing team can still explain in terms of participation, explaining why then the characterization of individual will increase the participation by using this motion. That's an example. This means that teams, closing teams, in this case, closing government, for example, contribute extension in form of analyzing characterization of individual and how that improve participation. Team only explain why participation is good. So this is still a new extension that you still can credit closing team upon. This means that you shouldn't judge closing team to be derivative too quickly. You need to compare which one is more explained if there's a similar nuance or similar argument. Which one is being framed as more crucial? What about response? Which response managed to disprove a point better? Which response more relevant to the response to an argument and response to a motion as well? So please don't judge closing team too quickly simply because their argument are similar with their opening. Do really see why then a certain argument or a certain analysis is actually new from closing, and why then that is more important, why then it's more significant to explain a certain argument, so on and so forth. And this is the last slide for me. Next will be continued by Batara. The last thing that I'll explain is about assessing whip speeches. What not to be, this is what I said earlier. Role fulfillment is not a thing anymore, but the exception is on whips. It's not really a role fulfillment, yeah, but it's more on limitation on what whip could do. Whip cannot bring a new argument because no one can respond that. So imagine being in closing opposition, being an opposition whip, you bring 3 new arguments. Of course, that argument can still stand because no one can respond. It will be unfair. Hence, you shouldn't credit whips, both government and opposition whips, if they bring a new argument. They may, however, add a new example, characterization, and impact as long as they still fall under the same conclusion and premises that be brought by the member. The new rebuttal is permitted, by the way, but be careful. So responses is something that you respond to a certain argument that already exists, right? So it's still allowed, but just be careful if a certain speaker sneakily try to incorporate a new argument instead of rebuttal. Yeah, this is sometimes a trick that's being used by whip speeches. So please make sure that you really see what the response really is. Just because the title is respond, that doesn't mean that you always treat everything as respond. Some individuals, some speakers might sneak a certain argument inside of a response. So please make sure to pay attention to that as well. Really see, is this really a response toward the opposing team, or is it a new argument that, fortunate enough, is actually having the same headline, having the same assertion, for example? If a team if a speakers bring a new materials, do not penalize them or deduct their score, for example. Treat it as if that they don't really say anything of that new material at all. So just assume that, oh, this is new material. Okay, I'll just pretend that this argument never exists because it really never exists before, and we shouldn't bring that. So yeah, let's treat it as non-existent, but you shouldn't penalize them simply because they bring a new materials. And that's how you assess it. Giving it to Batara to continue the seminar.
Okay, thank you, Hans. Just checking, am I audible here?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So for the rest of the judge briefing, first of all, we're going to go with resolving competing frameworks, and after that, we're going to go into common mistakes, OAs, and then scoring ranges. So continuing on what Hans already mentioned before, that you have to look at framing that is brought into the debate and whether or not that framing is important. But that doesn't mean that just because someone brings a framing, automatically it's the winning one. Because in an interesting debate, there could be multiple framing and multiple metrics that the teams introduce as to how you should be judging the debate. So because teams often debate on this, on which criteria should the round be judged by, and argue that their point should be judged using their specific framework, it is then allowed for you as the judge to assess which one is a more fair metric. So the judges should adjudicate this debate about criteria, and you shouldn't just apply whichever you want. So here's how you can assess this. First, you can look at whether or not one criteria or principle is something that is agreed upon by all teams and somewhat agreed upon as important. For example, if there's a motion about education and the something that everyone sort of already talks about is access for people who are underprivileged, people who are poor, etc. If that is something that has already been agreed upon, either one side saying that they can achieve that and the other side saying, no, we can achieve it better, then that is something that is already implicitly agreed, and therefore you can most likely count that as the framing of the debate. Second, if there is something that is if it's something that's quite explicit, or like something they already mentioned by word. If not, try to look at if there's something that is implicit, like maybe they haven't directly mentioned effectivity or the outcome of an educational policy, but if they talk about, oh, on our side we can gain these benefits for society, no, on our side we have different benefits for society, then you can sort of imply that there's a debate about outcome and what outcome is more important and which outcome is more likely. If not that, then try to see if no one is being specific or no one brings the clear framework, try to look at least maybe one team that proved their framework to be true and important. So if there's three teams, they just kind of make arguments and they kind of try to prove the argument, but not explain why it's important, then it's okay for you to look at the team that did try to give the criteria and either credit them for it, or also at least look at that criteria to judge the entire debate. If nothing applies, if no teams were able to assert a framework or a metric, or none of them were successful or none of them were convincing, then you can follow back you can fall back on the ordinary intelligent voter metric that was already mentioned previously. This should only be a last resort because it is very rare that no teams attempt anything to tell you what the debate should be judged on. One common mistake, though, is just because you're an ordinary intelligent voter, that doesn't mean that you can just say resort to utilitarian metrics. For example, what is the best outcome? What is the biggest benefit? Who impacts the economy positively the most? That shouldn't be your automatic option. Because if it's a debate regarding morals, then you can look at who has proven the morals better. If it's a debate about justice or the criminal justice system, you can look at what is more fair or fulfilling the metric of justice. So don't just use utilitarian metrics. If no one else says it, you should look at what the ordinary intelligent voter is likely to care about. So I think that should be it on resolving competing frameworks. Next is on next should be on common mistakes. So there's going to be a lot of these, basically in the same breakdown as to what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Here are just common mistakes that people often make. First is on assessing burdens. I think Hans already mentioned how it is often sometimes judges are not being fair and equal in imposing burdens. For example, when they're going to talk about, the debate is about outcome, let's say that's something that is finally agreed upon by everyone, it is outcome. If you put a burden on the government teams to prove why they can solve an issue, but on opposition, you say you don't give them that same burden to solve that issue or try to explain why that issue doesn't exist, then you're not being fair. Just because if one team has the burden to explain why their mechanism is likely, it shouldn't be fair, and it's not fair if you just buy the arguments of the other teams on their promises or their outcomes and not assess their likelihood or not assess their process analysis. If you're not fair in that way, most likely this could be considered a flawed way of judging. Second is not defining the judging metric. So we've already talked about how you can look at the frameworks in the debate, right? When you're either doing your OA or you're discussing with the other judges, or even when you're talking with the teams later on, you're not supposed to forget the judging metric. Just because someone in their argument already proved all the likelihood, already proved all the impact, you should still explicitly say that. For example, in the exchange between opening government and opening opposition, there was a clash about likelihood, and then you assess the rest of it. So you should mention what the judging metric is. Don't just say government said ABC, opposition said AB, and then you give it to government automatically because they proved it more. Be explicit and clear on the judging metric, whether it's likelihood, impact, characterization, engagement, etc. Third mistake usually is crediting the idea of not being comparative to losing teams as a reason for losing. So a team can still win, and a team can still have a very convincing analysis and very convincing standing in the round, even if they're focused on a lot of problem analysis or a lot of solution analysis in their case. Just because they might not be fully comparative, they didn't give the full comparison between their arguments and their opponents, that's not automatically a reason for them to get less points in the round, because they could have spent the majority of their time focusing on the problem set up or their solution, and might not directly compare to their opposing teams, but their arguments are still much more convincing than their opposing teams. Just because you are more attempt to be comparative, that's not automatically better than the opposing teams. Lastly is also omitting the burden of responding to other teams. If a team is only proving their arguments, but they're not at all trying to respond or engage to other teams, then it is quite dangerous to give them a lot of high credit automatically, because even if their arguments are true, even if their arguments could be interesting, if they don't respond to other teams, then it's on you to assess the arguments and whether or not it is better than other teams, or whether or not their team contributed in making another team weaker. So you still have to pay attention and to a team and whether or not they are giving a proper amount of response or not. If they literally don't respond at all, then it is something that puts you as the judge in a more difficult position. And so that could be one of the reasons why you could reduce the likelihood of them winning as well. So still remember that teams should still give a response, even something short like clarification or an attempt to disprove another team's arguments. That still should at least be done, even when you feel like their arguments are strong. Even if they feel like their arguments are strong, they still should respond to other teams, even if it's brief. So that's the first set of mistakes on assessing burdens. The next set of mistakes that are quite common in judging is on assessing contribution and assessing just the argument itself, just a team's argument on itself. First is what's quite common is judges giving the assessment, talking about an argument already being a winning argument or one team wins over another, just because they explain an argument, not necessarily their quality. So just because there's already, for example, in a debate about education, the opening teams were, let's say, quite generic and just talked about, oh, what is the principle of education? And let's say a closing team comes in and they just explain, oh, this is good for underprivileged students. But they don't explain why underprivileged students have a problem in the status quo. They don't explain how they solve that problem. And they don't really explain how this is more important than the general idea of education. If they have no attempt to do that, and you can, and then implicitly I can say they have lower quality, lower amount of analysis, they just keep repeating the assertions over and over again. In that scenario, you shouldn't value the closing team, that team's argument, just because they say an argument that has a more interesting title, a more unique title. If they put very minimal effort to explain that argument, then you shouldn't be valuing it higher than another team that already gave that already provided more quality in their analysis. Second is another mistake is weighing rebuttals differently than the way you assess arguments. As mentioned before in the previous parts of these seminars, rebuttals and responses are equal value to arguments. So if you want to assess, so same thing as before, just because you give a rebuttal, just because you give one response, for example, that doesn't automatically mean the argument that was being responded to already falls. Just because you give a response, that doesn't mean the team that was responded to already loses. You still have to assess, was this response interesting? Was this response something that actually took down the idea? Did this response have the same amount of effort and analysis as the opposing argument? So you should still pay attention to them equally as to how you would assess arguments. Thirdly is leaving out points that are left unresponded, because sometimes in a round, if there is a team that brings in an argument that no other teams respond to, that doesn't mean it's automatically weak. In fact, it could actually be very, very strong, because maybe other teams don't want to respond to it because they cannot think of another response. So if a team brings an argument and nobody responds to it, you should still assess the quality of that argument. Did that team try to sell this argument as something that is very important, and assess that? Even if it's not, and the way you can judge it, or the way you can explain this, is still talk about the judging metrics before. If this argument can already fulfill some judging metrics, if they can already introduce the importance of this argument, even if other teams don't respond to it, you can still justify it saying, well, this point did not get any response from the other teams, but the team that made this point already gave the outcomes. This was something that was already very important, something in line with the principle, whatever framework they say, you can still use that and explain. And because this is something that was proven to be important and left unresponded, their argument stands, and the outcomes that they want and the conclusions that they want still stand at the end of the debate. That's why it is valid. Lastly, on assessing contributions, Valuing responses based on their presence as opposed to their quality. I already basically mentioned it before. You shouldn't just count just because someone give one response or even multiple response. It is already enough to take down an argument, because if a team or a speaker brings in a very clear argument, has a lot of analysis, has a lot of illustration, has a lot of clear processes and logical backing, just because it had many responses, but maybe all of the responses were weak, all of the responses just use examples, all of the responses were very minimal in explanation, you can still count the argument that was responded to as standing. So you should still assess the quality of the response, not just because it's there doesn't mean automatically it's better than the argument or it takes on the argument it's attacking. So that should be it on assessing contributions. Next common mistakes is assessing contradictions. So this is something that could happen in a round, and it was already explained in the previous parts of the seminars on what a contradiction could look like. What should judges do if there's contradicting statements made by a speaker? How should you count this? First, if nobody points it out, if no other teams point it out, then you can treat it as if it was never said, that the contradiction basically didn't really happen and it didn't really harm the case of the team. You should not treat it as something harmful to their entire case if it was never pointed out to begin with, because it is something that you cannot just assume. You should credit it to the teams that pointed it out, but you shouldn't punish anyone if nobody points it out. If someone points it out, let's say OG had a inconsistent analysis. On first speaker, they said something was harmful. On second speaker, they say it is something that is actually beneficial. The first thing you should do is credit the speaker who points it out and to explain why the contradiction is bad. Just because they say, oh, there's a contradiction. First speaker said this, second speaker said this. There's not really much to credit there. But if they explain, oh, this contradiction means that their benefit doesn't happen, they are not consistent with their principle, the outcome that they're looking for is not likely then to happen. If they explain those sorts of things, then you can give them more credit. And if it is only pointed out and not explained at all, then you shouldn't be crediting that speaker that points it out. So there should still be an attempt and effort to explain why that contradiction is bad. Did it attack their effectivity? Did it attack their principle that they're going for because they're now inconsistent? Is it something that takes down their likelihood because they say the scenario is it is possible to do something, and then they say, oh, the scenario is it's not going to be possible for anything to happen at all, which attacks the first analysis, because if they believe that nothing will happen, then the likelihood of the first speaker doesn't happen. So there still should be effort to explain why the contradiction is bad. Otherwise, you don't really need to credit them. Next part of the common mistakes in judging. The other thing that is often assessed wrongly is facts. First is, just because someone brings facts, that doesn't automatically mean they have strong contribution. So facts could still be valid, but they should be used to support a certain point. They could be very similar to just using example or a scenario. So valuing a team that brings more facts, but they don't explain the logical links, is one of the common mistakes in judging. So just because they can explain all of the economic statistics, for example, in Indonesia, if the debate is talking about a developing nation, that doesn't automatically mean they're better. They still have to explain, okay, these are the facts. What does it mean? It means that the economy is going one way. It means that a certain industry is more likely to be successful. Therefore, we should support it. Therefore, there's a specific actor that they want to protect. Any of that can be valid. But just because they bring facts doesn't automatically mean they have contribution. Next is not acknowledging facts that are clearly false. So if there are very clear facts that an ordinary intelligent voter should know, then you are allowed to disregard points as completely wrong. For example, if someone talks about Donald Trump is a leftist or Donald Trump is a Democrat, that is just factually wrong. If someone says, oh, there is no conflict between Israel and Palestine, that is also wrong. So you need to be, you can still be paying attention to very clear facts, and then discard and forget about the arguments that forget about the facts that are delivered if it is something that is completely wrong. So it's not going to be counting as stepping in if it is something that is clearly false. If it is something that falls under specific knowledge, like maybe you work in a specific industry, then it is something that is more debatable. But if it's something that is obviously false, then you can discredit that and say that fact doesn't contribute to the argument. The argument could still be valid, but the example used could be irrelevant. So that's how you could assess these facts, and that's something that sometimes that is forgotten. If it's something that's clearly wrong, you shouldn't count it, and you should only look at their attempt at logic, for example, but you shouldn't focus and count their examples or facts as something contributing to their points. So that is it on assessing facts. But speaking of stepping in, what does it really mean? There's several ways stepping in could happen, because stepping in means that you're not judging the debate as it happens, but you're putting in other aspects that are not fair, or you're not fully judging. You're stepping in. First, the first thing you can do is putting in specific expertise or knowledge in your assessment. For example, things like if a team is talking about some sort of economic argument, but they didn't explain the economic analysis in the way that you understood the economy, because you've recently read an academic journal, you've recently went to a seminar, or you've recently looked up very specific facts, you shouldn't be stepping in and assessing, okay, this argument is wrong because of what I know, because of its specific knowledge. Basically, the way you can differentiate specific knowledge and general knowledge of the ordinary intelligent voter is whether or not it's something that a random person or the average person is likely to know. So barriers such as academic access, those sorts of things, you should consider that, and don't put in information, or don't expect the debaters to know exactly as much as you do. Second is using your own set of responses beyond the logical inquiries. So you shouldn't ever use the justification of like, oh, they should one team should have responded to the argument X by giving this response, but because they didn't respond, they lose. Basically, it's setting your expectations. Just because a team didn't give the responses that you expected or you wanted, that doesn't mean that it is something that is a reason for you to give negative points to the team that didn't bring it. So you should still only count the arguments and the responses that did happen. And then beyond the basic questions like, did they try to prove that this is true? Did they try to prove that this is important? Outside of those sorts of basic questions, you shouldn't be giving a negative assessment or a negative assessment over a team just because they didn't bring what you expected. Thirdly, running on the same idea is having expectations of what the debater should bring and discrediting them when they don't do it. So if there is an argument about education and nobody, for example, talks about privilege, nobody talks about the outcome of education in relation to getting work or anything like that, even if you think that's a great argument, even if you know that's a great argument that you've seen before, you shouldn't discredit teams just because they didn't bring that argument, because that would mean that, similar before, you're setting unrealistic burdens, you're setting unbalanced burdens, and it is very random from the judges and from the debaters what they're more familiar with and what they're expecting. So you should just judge the debate as is, assess the arguments that are there. Don't discredit them for not bringing arguments that you're expecting. Fourth is conforming to your preferential bias. So this, again, very simple, but if you're just because you're, for example, a conservative person and you are not agreeing with the points made by a team because it is a liberal argument, you shouldn't put this into your judgment or assessment. You should go out of your bias and try to understand their arguments. As long as they try to prove why their argument is relevant, why it is true, why it is important, then it is something that you should still consider fairly. Just because you personally disagree with them, for example, you have differing views on how you should be running the economy, the taxation, or anything like that, just because you don't agree with them, but they did try to explain why it is beneficial, what is the outcomes. You should still consider that and fairly assess that and not just discard them because you don't agree. Lastly, is not penultimately, is not taking notes. This is something that happens very, 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 very often in a lot of bad situations, and it is where some judges feel like they can remember exactly what is happening, so they don't want to take notes. First is you still should always take notes, as mentioned in the previous part of the judge briefing. You should always take notes. Second of all, even if you don't understand an argument, you should still take the notes to use them as a point of discussion later. Even if you understand the argument, note it down as well, just so you can make sure and confirm whether or not the content that you actually heard is exactly what the speaker said, because there could be inconsistency with what you heard, what you think, and what another judges think. So you should still make sure that you take notes. Lastly is filling the gap for the debaters. For example, completing an argument for them because you think you know where they are going. So if a team, for example, talks about the argument of, okay, we're going to be improving the economy with our argument, with our motion. If they don't say that, oh, improving the economy is something that helps vulnerable actors, it helps small, medium enterprise, UMKM, it helps people on the ground that are the most vulnerable. If they don't say those arguments, and if they don't finish the argument in that way, you're not allowed to jump in and say, oh, but that argument would have given benefit to these people. If they didn't explain that the benefit translates or reaches those actors, you can't count that as the conclusion for them. So you shouldn't give assessment on a team and just assume the outcome that they want. If they didn't say the outcome, if they didn't say the benefit, if they didn't say the conclusion, you shouldn't step in and say it, even if it is something intuitively likely and something that you predict might happen. You still shouldn't do that. You should still count it purely based on what the speakers did say. So that should cover a lot of what stepping in is. Next part of common mistake is assessing POIs. So first, do not treat a POI that is not taken the same as a damaging POI. You don't know if the POI is going to be damaging or not if it wasn't said. So if it's already mentioned before that, for example, if a team doesn't take any POIs, that could be something that is not persuasive. But just because they didn't take a POI, that doesn't automatically mean their whole argument is bad or their whole argument is unresponsive. Because a damaging POI is something that has its own value. You cannot assume that, oh, the POI would have been great from this team that brought a great argument if they didn't say it. So not taking a POI is still something that you could assess as being less persuasive, but the level of attack and the level of assessment you give to that shouldn't be the same as a POI that was delivered that was very, very strong. So there should be still a difference there. Second of all, do not use also a POI as just a reason for a loss. For example, even if it is important for engagement, you still need to judge the debate as is and not what could have been. So if, for example, both teams are in a debate, one team is taking one POI and the other team doesn't take any POIs, it doesn't automatically mean that a team that didn't take the POI is losing. If the speech part of the team that didn't take any POIs was better, they did more responses anyway, and overall they had better performance as a team, they could still win. Just because they didn't take as many POIs, that doesn't mean they automatically lose. Lastly, do not penalize teams that do not accept or offer POIs by reducing their scores directly. You should still assess POIs as they are. And just because, for example, in their speech, they didn't take any POI at all, it's like a -1 or -2 automatically. No, you should still assess whether or not their speech overall is something that is, and all of their contributions just on this, purely on the speech itself. So just because they don't take it, you shouldn't directly reduce their score. You should only take into account whether or not there were a lot of arguments they didn't respond to that should have been POI or anything like that. So don't penalize them by directly reducing their score. Next common mistake in judging is the other stuff. First is hiding behind reasoning of technicalities. I think Hans also already mentioned quite a few of these to justify loss. For example, if someone spoke over 7 minutes, they automatically lose because they didn't follow the rules. Or if someone spoke below 5 minutes, they automatically lose to another team that spoke 7 minutes. No, you should still assess the quality of their arguments and the attempts that they put into their speech, not just the amount of time that they spend. Second of all, this was something that was also mentioned before. Just because there people have different styles, different structures, you shouldn't penalize them as well. For example, if a team had a better structure, they signposted their argument speech, like first argument, first layer, outcome, second argument, first layer, those sorts of things. Just because they did that more, that doesn't automatically also put them in a higher position. So even if it is something that you feel like could be harder to follow, if the arguments are still more relevant, more higher quality, you should still look at that and not look at any technicality. And lastly, this is going to be very relevant in the regionals, but things like, oh, you didn't turn your camera on, or you didn't share your preferred POI method, so you lose, should be quite simple. You shouldn't be counting any of that in your assessment. Second is judging based on reputation. Never do this. Literally never do this. Just because a team or university has a better reputation, they have a better history, you feel like, quote unquote, their students are better than others, you feel like their background in debating is more experienced and they have more achievements, you shouldn't do that. You're still judged purely on the speeches that was delivered in the round, not because of their history, not because of their name, not because of their location or anything like that. And lastly is when you're doing your OA, which we'll get into soon here, allocating more time to justify when a more reputable team loses, not cute. You shouldn't do this. If they lose, they lose. You shouldn't just spend more time justifying a loss to a strong team based on their name, just because you're afraid they will confront you. You should be more confident in your own ability, and you should still give the justification equally between all of the teams. So that's what those are the other mistakes. So next is the discussion or the conferral process. So those are all the mistakes, and this is the next conferral process. So quickly, the rundown on the technicalities. First, you have strictly 15 minutes to confer. From the end of the debate, you only have 15 minutes to discuss and come to a conclusion and then submit the ballot. How you should be doing this? The first advice is to take the first minute or maybe the first 2 minutes to read through your notes and confirm your initial call and initial decision. Once you're ready, the judges will make their own rankings first. And this is not something that you have to be specific, like rank 1, 2, and 3, and 4. You can still share, for example, if there are close teams. For example, you're confident in the first rank, you're confident in the fourth rank, but second and third, it is quite close. You can still mention that. Or you're confident in the fourth rank, but you're confident in the third rank, but first and second, it's still close. Mention that in your discussion. Next is chair judges need to facilitate the discussion and moderate with their time. So if you become a chair judge, or if you look at the chair judge, their job should be to be the ones pointing at, okay, who is going to speak next, how long they have to speak, etc. If it is almost 15 minutes already and no results have been achieved, then you should go directly going to the voting system. Do not delay the tab. The tab team and other parts of the ORCOM will go to you at the 15 minutes at the end of the discussion and guarantee that you guys are going to go vote at the end of your discussion. Lastly, after the decision is finalized, either before the 15 minutes or right at 15 minutes, the chair should fill in the online ballots. Panels and trainees, you do not need to fill the ballots at all. You still might have the link in your private URL later, but the person that is filling the ballot should only be the chair. But it is still advisable for the chairs to discuss and confirm with the other judges what the scores are before filling it in. So there still could be a discussion on, for example, what the scores are, and just confirming or like sharing the screen on what the ballot looks like. But again, it's only the chair that should be filling out. So that's the technicalities. Going into the conferral process in more detail in the next slide is how do you make it more efficient? So this is how some tips to make it more efficient. First, during the first 1 or 2 minutes of the discussion, take your time to first make your initial call, and then second, isolate and make 1 or 2 the most important points from a team, and prioritize based on what affects your decision the most, not just chronologically. So let's say a team on OG, they bring 2 arguments. Their first argument's not really that important. You believe that it didn't really contribute to your decision, but their second argument is something that is more important. You can write the second argument more on and like pay attention to that more. Second of all, is not just mentioned here, is other than formulating your initial call at the end of the discussion, you can start creating your decision, start assessing teams throughout the round. So if the opening teams are already finished, you can probably start to already have a decision between OG and OO. Which one do you think is winning? When closing government comes in with their member speech, you can start to compare. Did they beat their opening? Do they have response to OO? And then by government whip, by the end of the government whip speech, you could probably have at least an initial feeling, an initial understanding of, okay, looks like by the end of CG speech, they were able to beat their opening or not. During the end of CG speech, could they beat O or not? So you can have this formulation of initial call, not just at the very end of the debate. You can start doing that throughout the debate. Once the discussion starts, this is the protocol you should be following. First is just give your initial call. For example, who is rank 1, rank 2, rank 3, and 4. You don't have to jump into your justifications immediately. Wait for the chair, because second of all, the chair will moderate. So the chair will start with the most contentious calls. For example, if there's a ranking where some judges give a team first, some judges give a team fourth, that should be the first analysis and the first thing that was discussed. And then from the chair, be sure to ask the members of the panel one by one to share their thoughts. Don't just be like, for the chair, don't just be like, okay, who wants to start? Because that will take away time and you don't really know who can start. So a chair should either point at someone to start sharing their thoughts, or the chair could start to initiate the discussion as well. Third, be directly topical, stick to precisely just the 2-team comparison at one time. Identify the main thing, and that is the clash. For example, the debate between OG and OO, it's about who can prove the effectivity of their policy more, of their side more. Focus on that first. Don't bring in the closing teams, and then stick to that until that comparison is resolved, and you get the outcome of which team is higher between one team and another. For the panelists and the trainees, stick to specifically what the chairs are asking. If the chair is asking about, okay, between OG and OO, what do you think about the effectivity? Only answer about effectivity. Don't just suddenly start jumping in, oh, but also OO were better in their principle, OO also already did this, OO also already did this. Don't just try to explain everything away, because you then sound kind of greedy in the discussion and kind of like you really want to show how much you know about the round. Stick to specifically what the chair is asking about, so you can have the discussion be efficient and have a correct direction. Just because you have something you want to say, you shouldn't just keep jumping in and like explain everything away. You could probably like raise your hand and try to ask something, but still rely and focus on the chair to moderate the discussion. So that's the first set of tips regarding making the conferral and discussion process more efficient. Second of all is, how do you reach the consensus? So that's how you do the discussion. This is how you can start to logically move your way to reaching the consensus and the results. Remember that a conferral process is an exchange of thoughts. So don't forget about your self-righteousness, your ego, or your like interest just to show whatever ideas you feel like are true. Instead, focus on discussing with others to reach the consensus. Just because you feel like a team already won, don't get stuck in that ego and that thought. You should still be focusing on discussion. Second, pay attention to what others are saying. Just because there are other panels and trainees, it doesn't mean they don't have anything meaningful to say. So for the chair, pay attention to them, but also for the panels, listen to the fellow panels and the fellow trainees as well. They could still give valuable insight depending on the round and depending on what happened. Thirdly, also panels and trainees, please be encouraged to defend what you think is right. Don't just be yes men and just like follow whatever the chair says. If the chair says, I don't think this team were able to prove this argument, don't just automatically say, okay, sorry, I think I did that wrong. You can still try and defend what you think is right. You can still try and, for example, say, I think they still were able to do this. They were able to still prove their argument by explaining 1, 2, and 3. So I still somewhat believe their argument. So that's something you can still you should still be brave enough to do, because that's normal part of discussion. When the chair disagrees with your statements, don't just make statements like, but they said blah blah blah, so that point doesn't stand. But you should try to make it a question. So for example, if you think that something is wrong, or you think that an argument is not proven yet, try to formulate it in the form of a question. For example, how do you value X argument compared to the Y argument brought by the other teams? This will make it so the panelists and trainees can specifically talk about those values, rather than just say, oh, it doesn't stand, or, oh, this argument is automatically wrong. Don't just make statements, try to initiate questions. Next is acknowledge that you may or may not miss several points. So for example, several questions in the Q&A part, people say like, oh, I might have not heard something, I might have missed something, I might have not understood something. Be willing to acknowledge that you might miss that point. And so, but keep discussing like, oh, maybe you didn't understand the point, but you heard those words. So you can discuss on, oh, I think the team were trying to explain this. I think the team were able to prove this. So you can still be open to the idea that you can sort of fill in each other's gaps. Lastly is panelists and trainees should also be assessed by how helpful they are during the discussion. So the chairs, be aware of this, how helpful they are in the discussion, and just being submissive and following like, oh, they were just saying yes, yes, yes. That doesn't mean they are more contributive to the discussion. At the same time, for the panelists and trainees, also be aware that your scoring will be dependent on how helpful you are during the discussion. If you're just repeating what the speaker said, then you're not really helpful. But if you give your perspective on the round, you give your conclusion, you try to help the debate, the conferral process move forward, and giving judging metrics that you believe was heard in the round, try to give comparisons. Those are the things that are, and answering the chair's questions more directly, those are what's considered helpful during the discussion. And so for the chairs, you shouldn't just let your ego talk and say, oh, they were quiet, they didn't oppose me at all, automatically they're better. You shouldn't think of it that way. So after reaching a consensus, what else in the conferral process? Okay, so next is on voting. So voting should again be a last resort, only when nearing the end of the 15 minutes, nothing happens. So a stubborn judge with no reasoning whatsoever is a bad judge. If you just jump into voting, or like want to initiate voting before everything ends, then most likely you're a bad judge, because you don't want to try and change or listen at all. So you are encouraged to be as open-minded as possible. For example, if you did miss something, acknowledge that and be happy to change your decision. That doesn't make you a bad judge, even if you change your decisions. So if you're a panel, be open to listening to it. Same thing as a chair, be open to listen to it. But when voting does happen, don't just be like, okay, this is my vote, I'm done. You should still try to justify why you split. Because one, so to recap, voting should still be a last resort when you can't come to a consensus. Second, voting should be done between two teams specifically to determine which one is higher. And in a case where two voting judges are present, for example, a chair and a panel, the chair has 2 vote counts. Or if it's an even panel, if it's 2, if it's 4, the chair has 2 votes to override them. If it's an odd number like 3 or 5, then everyone gets 1 vote. And remember, just because you vote, you still need to explain. Like, for example, between OG and OO, other judges believe it's OG, you believe it's OO. Don't just say, okay, I'm OO, I'm done. Say, okay, I'm OO because we don't agree on this point about effectivity. You guys might believe that it is something that OG proven, but I think based on what my assessment is, I still think OO were able to prove it better. So this is because we don't agree on the quality of the arguments. That's why I'm willing to split and I'm going to vote for the other team. So still justify and give reasoning for your vote. Don't just vote for the sake of it. Next is the scoring range of the speakers. So I'm not going to go through each bracket and explain them because they should be self-explanatory, but I'm more going to explain how you can use this range. So from this bottom half of the bottom part of the range from 50 to 66 is already self-explanatory in the individual points there. How some arguments, if you're 66 at best, they make a few arguments that are maybe relevant, and they may have explanations, but there's no really logical explanations there, and they are often unclear in their speech, so it is difficult to give them credit. Next in the range, for example, is 73 and 75. Arguments are most exclusively relevant. They may fail to address one or more core issues sufficiently, etc. All of the explanation should be there. In the next scoring range, this is just an example. So how do you use the scoring range really? So first is look at the explanations in the range. Let's look at 76 to 78. Look at the speech and whether or not it falls into that range. If you feel like most of their arguments are relevant and they do start to address the core issues of the debate, then you can give them in the 76 to 78 range. And then look at their analysis. If it can still have deficit and explanation, it's missing a little bit of things. It might have some simplistic arguments that can be vulnerable to competent response, like it can very easily be responded to, or it may have some irrelevant, inexclusive, like not really important arguments in their speech. It can fall under that range, and manner-wise or style-wise, it is clear enough. So and structure-wise, it is clear enough, so you can credit them. Then that means then you can use that range for their score. How do you differentiate within that range? Is going to be looking at the metric and whether or not they fulfill that or not. If they are almost exclusively relevant and address core issues, then it falls under that range. But then look at the quality of analysis, for example. If they do have quite a lot of deficit and explanation, they have quite a few irrelevant arguments, they have a few simplistic arguments that are just assumptions, you can probably give them 76. But if they have like just a little bit of deficit and explanation, maybe only one irrelevant part of their argument, you can probably give them 78. So fall under that, see if that falls under the range first, and then look whether or not they are on the top part of that range or the bottom part of that range. So yeah, we can move to the next parts. Okay, so filling in the ballot, speaker scale, and feedback. So only chairs need to submit the ballot as before. As a reference, you can use when we share this, you can use the document for the speaker scale that was the same as before. Panels and trainees, you don't need to submit the ballot, just like before. Chairs must submit their feedback on their panels and wings and trainees based on the discussion or deliberation. So please use the document for the scales that we're linking as well for the feedback score from 1 to 10. You can use them the same as the scoring range. The ballots will be submitted online and physically. So you can give your physical ballot to the runner assigned to your room or venue. That's going to be for the online, for the national level, but on the regional level, because it's still all online, you'll be submitting the online ballots. And just a reminder, panel and training, you don't need to submit feedback to your chair. You don't have to submit anything. You should just contribute to the discussion, and you should only start doing stuff when you're a chair. Next, for the OAs, you only have 10 minutes. First of all, fill in the ballot before you start delivering your OA. Never like start your OA before the ballots are submitted. And then you only have 10 minutes to deliver your OA. So you have 15 minutes of deliberation, 10 minutes for the actual OA. Announce the ranks from the very beginning. Don't like spend too much time on general comments. And in fact, a lot of times you can skip the general comments unless you believe that it is very, very necessary, or just to clarify maybe your judgment over the debate. So that should be the first part. Like, okay, thank you for the debate. My OA will be the ranks, then justification between the ranks. So announce the ranks immediately. Next is clearly make comparison between each team. Don't just repeat what they said, but clearly elaborate why the fourth ranking team is below the other three and the third ranking team, etc. More on this on the next slide. Basically, make a six-way comparison. Avoid giving constructive feedback in the OA. Like once you explain why an argument or a team wins or loses, don't like then give feedback. You could have delivered this. You could have said this. Don't fill in that part. You can do that after the OA because it'll take away time from you. Remember, what you deliver, it'll be evaluated by the debaters as well. So make sure your OA is something that you constructed well. And lastly, in a case where the chair is dissenting in a vote, then either of the panel should be doing the OA. So if there's a voting scenario, the chair has one vote, they are voting for the team that didn't win, and then the two other panels disagree with them and vote for the other team, then one of the panels should be the one delivering the OA. Next part is on what the OA structure should be. You should be doing holistic judging. Because there are 4 teams in a debate, you should be giving the direct rankings and direct comparisons between each of them. So you shouldn't just say the 4th team lose to the 3rd team, 3rd lose the 2nd, 2nd lose the 1st. That's just making 3 comparisons. That is not enough. You should be doing a 6-way comparison. For example, start with explaining why the 4th ranked team loses to team 1, team 2, team 3. Explain why the 3rd ranking team loses to the top 2 teams, and then the comparison between the final 2 teams. So you can either start from 1st rank, explain why they beat 3 other teams, or 4th rank and how they directly beat the lose to the 3 other teams, 3rd, and then etc. Another variation, you can do it chronologically. For example, start with OG case, compare OO to OG, and then when CG comes in, compare CG to OG, compare CG to OO, etc. Make sure explicitly you mention in a comparison which one wins after each exchange, after each comparison. Next up on the OA. Lastly, on the appendix here. So if you happen to judge in a room with an iron person speaker, this is just some additional technicalities. What you do is, one, just because there's an iron person speaker, they don't automatically lose. They can in fact still win. Second, score them as if there were still 2 different speakers. Like, just because they're the same person, that doesn't mean they automatically get the same score. How you continue with the technicality is that you mark the lower scoring speech as a duplicate speech in the online ballot. It'll be a thing that might be shown later on how the ballot you can tick a box and show, okay, this is the duplicate speech, that is the lower scoring one. If you encounter a speaker who potentially made an offensive remark or any other forms of equity violation, here's what you should do. Still judge the debate as is and score the speaker based on the quality of the overall speech, but make a report to the equity team about such violation later on. What you shouldn't do is punish the speaker by lowering their score, let alone give them an automatic loss. So even if they did say something that was offensive, something that was unfair, discriminative, or like something that was relying on stereotypes, for example, that doesn't automatically mean they lose. They might be not that convincing because the analysis itself might not be convincing, but they don't automatically lose. They don't automatically have lower scores or anything at all. So that should be it for the judge briefings. Next up on how we're going to be addressing the questions. So we're going to be making a form later on for all of the questions because we see that there's a lot of questions in the chat and we're already behind on time. So we're going to be sharing a form later on that you can fill out, and we'll be giving all of the answers for all of those questions at a later date. And we will publish the answers later on in all of the debaters and the judges groups as well. So if you have your question now, you can just copy and paste it, send it to keep it somewhere, and just fill in that question again in the form that we'll be distributing later on. That should be it from the CAP on the briefings. Next, we're going to be giving it to the tab and tech team for the next of the briefings. Thank you for this, and good luck in NUDC later on.
Hello, everyone. Um, Hello, everyone. My name is Andre. I'm a top director for NUDC 2023. Um, we are supposed to start the tech briefing at 3 waktu Indonesia Barat. However, we noticed that we only have 400 people in this Zoom meeting. But I would really love to have this tech and tech briefing actually attended by everyone, including auditors and educators. So we are going to wait for 5 minutes. In the meantime, uh, please call your friends, your educators, your students, and to return to this Zoom meeting and we'll start. Thank you. Have a nice day. Okay, hello everyone. Hello everyone. Once again, we are going to start with the tech briefing. I hope my voice is clear enough now. Okay. So we are going to start with the tech briefing by 3 p.m. of the Indonesia Barat. However, we noticed that it's only 450 individuals in this Zoom meeting, but we wish this tech briefing will be attended by everyone, including debaters and educators alike. That said, we're going to wait for 5 minutes. We're going to wait for 5 minutes. In the meantime, please call your students, your friends, the debater of your institution to come in and participate. Thank you. Hello everyone. It's 3:05. We are going to start immediately with the technical briefs on the structure. I hope my voice is clear now. Can anyone confirm? Cool. If I'm audible, thank you for confirming. I would really love to say hi to everyone. Welcome to this year's NUDC 2023. My name is Andre. I will be your tech director and your technical director. So anything technical related, tabulations, Zoom, WhatsApp group, it will be all on us. Just to be clear, anything that is administrative related, certificates, surat tugas, whatsoever is really out of my scope and I cannot help you with that. That said, I'm here co-directing with Elaine Charmendi from Universitas Indonesia. She's going to be joining us later on this session. So that said, if your debater can attend this meeting, we will presume that you can read and you will read this guide that have been shared earlier this week. So there will be no excuses throughout the tournament when we expect all of you to understand how the selection and how the tournament works. That said, this is how this year's seperti yang sudah di brief, disosialisasi dan di pedoman dan di banyak tempat, tahun ini seleksi wilayah berformat turnamen dan bukan upload video dan dinilai dan teman-teman akan lolos atau tidak lolos. Tahun ini teman-teman akan berdebat dalam turnamen regional yang sudah dibagi dalam grup masing-masing. Seluruh tim dan juri N1 wajib mengikuti seluruh ronde penyisian. Akan ada 6 ronde penyisian. There will be 6 preliminary rounds and all teams and N1 judges are obliged to participate. Peringkat setiap ronde, jadi seperti layaknya turnamen, peringkat setiap ronde penyisian akan disampaikan dalam penjurian lisan, kecuali ronde yang merupakan babak kuning, di mana tidak ada penjurian lisan yang akan diberikan setelah babak kuning berakhir. After 6 preliminary round ends, top X teams based on points accumulated by from the preliminaries will compete. Top X teams based on points accumulated from the preliminaries will compete in open elimination rounds. Top X teams from each LLDT will be selected to represent their LLDT. Top X teams from each LLDT will be selected to represent their LLDT in national round in June. Then, top judges based on feedback scores like earlier brief and Educator similar throughout preliminaries will be awarded breaking judges and will be allocated for elimination rounds. Semoga cukup jelas. Jadi di setiap seleksi wilayah akan ada 6 babak penyisihan. Semua tim, semua juri N1 wajib mengikuti. Lalu akan dipilih berapa tim terbaik yang akan bertanding di babak eliminasi secara keseluruhan. Lalu berapa tim dari setiap LLDT akan dipilih berdasarkan kuota untuk mewakili masing-masing LLDT di babak nasional. Kanal informasi, seluruh tim dan juri N1 sudah atau akan diundang masuk ke dalam grup WhatsApp sesuai dengan peran dan kompetisi yang diikuti. Seluruh informasi penting dan genting akan disebarkan dalam grup ini. Demi menjaga keamanan, kami tidak akan membagikan tautan undangan grup. We are not going to share the things. If you feel like you are not invited yet, we have provided you the form to do so. Jadi, teman-teman sudah di-invite masuk. Teman-teman tidak perlu masuk
teman-teman diharapkan mengecek apakah teman-teman sudah di-invite masuk ke dalam grup. Teman-teman tidak, apabila teman-teman sebagai debater, teman-teman tidak perlu masuk ke grup yang judges tidak perlu masuk ke grup yang debater, teman-teman tidak perlu masuk ke grup dari LLBT lain, dan seterusnya. Apabila ada teman yang belum masuk, udah ada formnya di dalam grup, di announcements, mohon diperhatikan. So, debate platform. Multiple Zoom meetings will be used as the main platform to hold the debate throughout the competition. The Zoom meetings will be named Building A, B, and C, and so forth. Motions alongside other important informations throughout the tournament will be announced inside the Zoom meetings. Since multiple Zoom meetings will be used, we will number them like A1, B2, C3, and so on and so forth. Jadi kalau A1 berarti room 1 di building A. C8 berarti room 8 di C8. Roomnya akan, this room will be clickable on the draw page on the this room.
This room will be clickable on the draw page, which we will explain later. So this is how a round would look like. Every morning we will have a roll call or check-in. This will be done through everyone's private URL. Apakah suara saya masih kurang jelas?
Jelas, Pak.
Oke. Ya.
Ya, kalau suaranya memang kurang bisa jelas, teman-teman bisa berusaha perhatikan. Otherwise, semua informasinya ada di layar. Teman-teman bisa sambil mengikuti melalui slide yang dipresentasikan. Akhirnya setiap pagi akan ada check-in akan dilakukan melalui private URL yang akan dibagikan ke teman-teman. Sekarang belum dibagikan. Kita akan bagikan 1-2 hari sebelum seleksi. Sebelum seleksi teman-teman dilaksanakan. Apabila teman-teman tidak check-in, kita tidak akan include teman-teman dan kita akan anggap teman-teman tidak hadir di hari itu. Setelah check-in selesai, kita akan merilis draw, kita akan merilis mosi, teman-teman akan mempersiapkan kasus, you will be case building, you will be debating, then you will be listening to verbal education, oral education, then you will give judge feedback based on those oral educations. So, check-in. Check-in dilakukan secara individu oleh seluruh anggota tim dan bukan diwakilkan oleh tim. Ini dilakukan sekali sehari sesuai dengan waktu check-in yang telah dijadwalkan. Ini dilakukan melalui private URL masing-masing yang telah dibagikan, dan tim dan juri yang gagal melakukan check-in tepat waktu tidak akan diikutsertakan dalam ronde yang dilaksanakan pada hari tersebut. Draw akan diumumkan langsung di WhatsApp group. Kita tidak menggunakan Discord, akan langsung diumumkan di WhatsApp group. Segera bukalah mendraw melalui tautan yang diberikan dan catat ruangan dan posisi di mana Anda dialokasikan pada ronde tersebut. Jadi teman-teman akan melihat laman seperti ini. Anda berdebat sebagai tim apa, di ruangan mana, lawan Anda siapa. Apabila teman-teman sebagai juri, teman-teman dapat melihat teman-teman menjuri siapa, di ruangan mana, sebagai apa, apakah sebagai panelis, atau sebagai trainee, dan lain sebagainya. Kami harapkan teman-teman bisa langsung masuk ke Zoom meeting yang benar dengan menekan nomor ruangan di mana Anda dialokasikan dan ubah nama Anda di dalam Zoom sesuai dengan format yang diberikan, yaitu ronde, spasi ruangan, spasi posisi, spasi nama lengkap. Jadi kalau teman-teman ya seperti contoh yang sudah ada di situ. Lalu Sekitar 15 menit setelah waktu perilisan draw, mosi akan dirilis di tiap Zoom building. Waktu persiapan kasus adalah 15 menit dimulai dari waktu mosi dirilis. Teman-teman kami harapkan bisa langsung masuk dan tunggu di dalam Zoom breakout room di mana Anda dialokasikan. Selama waktu persiapan kasus, pendebat hanya boleh berdiskusi dengan teman satu timnya. Tim dipersilakan menggunakan platform manapun yang mereka pilih. Apakah Anda mau WhatsApp call aja dengan teammate teman-teman, apakah teman-teman mau hadir, bertemu langsung dengan teammate, atau apapun. Kami tidak membatasi. During the debate, seluruh pendebat dan juri wajib berada di dalam breakout room saat debat akan dimulai. Ketua juri or your chair will wait for 2 to 3 minutes kalau Anda yang belum hadir, dan akan memulai tanpa Anda apabila Anda tidak hadir atau tidak ada kabar. Seluruh pendebat wajib kamera selama debat berlangsung, dan sebelum debat dimulai, kami harapkan teman-teman memberikan urutan pembicara. Siapa yang menjadi pembicara pertama, siapa yang menjadi pembicara kedua, dan juga preferensi menerima interupsi di kolom chat. Apakah misalkan teman-teman menerima interupsi melalui kolom chat, atau secara verbal, atau raise hand, atau lain sebagainya. Contoh seperti yang teman-teman lihat di gambar pada kanan, di kanan. Seluruh pendebat juga wajib menghormati preferensi interupsi lawan yang sedang berbicara. Jadi apabila lawan berbicara Anda preferensinya adalah melalui chat box, diharapkan tidak menyalakan audio teman-teman. Atau apabila menggunakan raise hand, mungkin teman-teman jangan melalui chat box. Kira-kira seperti itu. Setelah debat selesai, semua pendebat diharapkan menunggu di dalam main room. Para juri diharapkan tinggal di dalam breakout room. Jadi debaters keluar dari breakout room dan stay di main room. Jangan leave Zoom. Judges stay inside the breakout room to deliberate, to confer. Pendebat akan menunggu di main room hingga ketua juri Anda memanggil Anda untuk kembali ke breakout room. Until your chair tells you to return to the breakout room to listen to the OA, to listen to the oral adjudication. Debaters are obliged to listen to verbal adjudication wherever applicable. Jadi teman-teman debater wajib untuk mengikuti penjurian lisan. Tidak ada alasan, oh saya tidak membutuhkan penjurian lisannya. Saya tahu saya akan mendapatkan first, atau saya tahu akan saya mendapatkan fourth. Saya tidak mau mendengarkan. Teman-teman diwajibkan mendengarkan karena teman-teman akan mendengarkan satu orang juri yang akan menyampaikan OE, dan teman-teman wajib menilai juri tersebut berdasarkan OE yang diberikan. Teman-teman akan menilai kualitas penjurian lisan, apakah fair, apakah cukup jelas, dan lain sebagainya. Teman-teman tidak menilai konstruktif yang diberikan. Teman-teman tidak menilai pendapat yang diberikan setelah juri tersebut keluar dari perdebatan. Untuk memberikan penjurian lisan, ada pertanyaan di chat box, adakah share materinya? Materi ini sudah di-share dari minggu lalu, jadi teman-teman sudah bisa mengakses slide ini dari hari Senin atau hari Selasa saat grup dibuat. Setelah mendengarkan penjurian lisan, tiap tim wajib memberikan umpan balik juri kepada juri yang memberikan penjurian lisan melalui private URL. Please submit judge feedback towards the judge who delivered the OA through the private URL. Satu tim hanya mengumumkan satu umpan balik diwakilkan oleh salah satu anggota. Jadi tidak perlu dua speaker mengumpulkan feedback yang sama. Berikan umpan balik hanya untuk juri yang memberikan penjurian lisan. Submit to judge feedback only to the judge who gives the OA. Do not submit to the judges who don't deliver OA. Logikanya adalah teman-teman debater sudah disiapkan WhatsApp group masing-masing, N1 juga sudah disiapkan grup masing-masing. Jadi logikanya adalah teman-teman akan mendengarkan seseorang yang memberikan penjurian lisan, sehingga tidak masuk akal apabila teman-teman menilai seseorang yang tidak memberikan OA tersebut. Teman-teman tidak masuk akal apabila teman-teman bisa menilai seseorang yang tidak memberikan oral education. Juga tidak masuk akal apabila teman-teman memberikan kepada semua orang karena hanya ada satu orang chair yang berikan. Hanya memberikan oral education tersebut. Beberapa aturan-aturan yang kita ingin teman-teman pelajari, swing team dan iron person, atau tim dan pidato pengganti. So, if your entire team is missing when the debate is about to start, we are going to replace your team with swing team for that round. Hence, your team will not be debating in that particular round. Sub team will wait for 2 to 3 minutes to which the debate will proceed with swing teams. Jadi, kita akan tungguin teman-teman kalau tim teman-teman nggak ada di dalam breakout room saat debatnya mulai selama 2 sampai 3 menit. Kalau teman-teman nggak hadir, kita akan langsung kirim swing team. Kalau ada ronde lain di hari tersebut, teman-teman mungkin kita bisa alokasikan ke ronde berikutnya. Lalu, apabila dengan alasan apapun, salah satu anggota tim tidak hadir atau tidak dapat memberikan pidato saat giliran mereka. Anggota tim yang hadir dapat memberikan pidato pengganti. Berarti anggota yang hadir tersebut akan berpidato sebanyak 2 kali. Debat dapat ditunda selama 2-3 menit untuk menunggu anggota yang tidak hadir apabila terjadi isu dengan koneksi atau hotness. Hal ini berlaku untuk alasan apapun. Jadi apabila ada koneksi yang bermasalah dan lain sebagainya, the policy applies. Kita akan tungguin 3 menit. Kalau teman-teman tidak datang, kita akan langsung kirim swing team atau teman-teman harus iron person. Secara garis besar, berikut. Tim yang tidak hadir atau melakukan pidato pengganti hanya pada satu ronde babak penyisihan masih berhak dan diperbolehkan untuk melaju ke babak eliminasi. Tim yang tidak hadir dan atau melakukan pidato pengganti pada lebih dari satu ronde babak penyisihan tidak diperbolehkan melaju ke babak eliminasi. Tim yang melakukan keduanya tidak diperbolehkan melaju ke babak eliminasi. Tim tidak diperbolehkan untuk tidak hadir atau melakukan pidato pengganti pada babak eliminasi. Eligibility rules also applies untuk eligibility ke babak nasional. Observer, setiap babak pada pertandingan NUDC atau KDMI tidak diperbolehkan untuk ditonton oleh pihak luar. Hanya partisipan yang terdaftar dalam NUDC atau KDMI yang dapat masuk dan menonton jalannya perdebatan, dan tim tabulasi berhak mengeluarkan siapapun dari Zoom apabila kami tidak dapat mengidentifikasi orang tersebut. Apabila Anda sebagai debater atau sebagai tim memberikan nilai umpan balik yang salah kepada juri Anda bisa resubmit judge feedback-nya. Apabila Anda resubmit, nilai yang sebelumnya akan dihapus dan nilai yang baru akan langsung digunakan. Apabila Anda sebagai juri, panel atau juri trainee, apakah Anda mengumpulkan ballot? Tidak. Apakah Anda sebagai juri panel atau juri trainee, apakah Anda mengumpulkan feedback? Tidak. Feedback hanya diberikan oleh ketua juri kepada panel dan trainee, dan hanya diberikan oleh tim kepada ketua juri. Kira-kira seperti itu yang dapat saya sampaikan. Saya akan mulai menjawab satu persatu pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang ada di kolom chat. Ada pertanyaan dari Muhammad Faisal, penentuan termasuk chair dan lain-lainnya melalui metode apa? Alokasi oleh CAP, nilai ditentukan dari gabungan hasil tes akreditasi tambah feedback dari chair. Feedback dari debater. Ini pertanyaan yang sama ya, udah saya lihat berulang-ulang. Apakah slide-nya akan di-share? Yes. Mohon diperhatikan. Untuk akreditasi juri, setelah ini, untuk akreditasi setelah ini akan di-share soal yang teman-teman harus kerjakan. Terdiri dari soal dan menilai video tes atau yang biasa disebut exhibition debate. Ada pertanyaan lagi, berapa jam turnamennya per hari? Kami mohon siapkan satu hari ada 3 ronde. Satu ronde akan kira-kira 2-3 jam. Kami harapkan teman-teman dapat menyiapkan diri dari jam 7 pagi sampai jam 7 malam waktu setempat. Jadwal detail akan dibagikan kemudian. Untuk soal tes juri akan dibagikan di mana? Di WhatsApp group. Sekarang belum dibagikan. Akan dibagikan setelah seminar usai. I'm sorry, so in preliminary, every team needs to participate for 6 times. Yes. Untuk memperjelas lagi, untuk link Zoom turnamennya nanti diklik di website langsung dan tidak di-share ke WA. Yes. Sudah ada form untuk request ini. Silahkan tanyakan temannya yang sudah masuk BRP akan izin konfirmasi untuk ujian akreditasi itu batasnya 7 hari ya. Deadline akan diumumkan saat kita merilis soal. Yang belum masuk ke grup atau yang belum diundang ke grup, silakan gunakan link ini. Apakah setiap ronde akan ada peserta yang didiskualifikasi? Silakan ke pertanyaan ini sudah dijawab. Di babak pengisi. Di prelim tidak ada. Di elim, yes. Bagaimana halnya jika pada hari ini ada komitmen, ada kita tidak bisa memberikan keringanan Apabila ada komitmen atau agenda lain, akan di-approve per case basis. Tapi ketidakhadiran N1 akan mempengaruhi eligibility dari tim. Is there any probabilities that the adjudicators do not pass the test? If yes, does that mean they cannot participate in the tournament? Ini sudah dijelaskan seharusnya di adjudicator sebenarnya, tapi just in case belum. There's no passing, not passing. Tidak ada lulus tidak lulus. Yang ada adalah ini menentukan teman-teman akan bertindak sebagai panel, akan bertindak sebagai chair atau sebagai panel di hari tersebut. Semua N1 tetap akan berpartisipasi. Semoga cukup jelas. How to ask for feedback after we finish the round? We'll provide the judges' contacts later on. Okay. Is there any dress code? Tidak ada aturan resmi, bebas, rapi, sopan. Berapa? Saya belum masuk WA group. We have the job description for chair, panelist, and trainee. This is literally education briefing earlier. Please refer to that. Mempengaruhi eligibility, maksudnya tim mengarah ke debatersnya, Pak. Ya, apabila N1-nya tidak hadir, ya timnya tidak bisa free. Untuk waktu pelaksanakan akan disesuaikan dengan WIB, tidak disesuaikan dengan time zone masing-masing wilayah. Pengecualian adalah wilayah 4 yang ada 2 time zone. Kita akan sesuaikan ke 2 time zone tersebut. Regarding accreditation status, is it permanent or is it mandatory to be updated every year or so? We will answer this later. When we have. Apakah kalian akan menjuri dari LLDP yang sama? Tidak ada konflik untuk LLDP yang sama. Hanya tim institution conflict. I.e., you will not touch your own unit. Apakah akreditasi N1 akan mempengaruhi tim? Tidak. Kita akan tutup pertanyaan-pertanyaan 2 menit lagi karena saya merasa banyak pertanyaan yang mengulang-ulang. Untuk jadwal kita sudah pernah share sebelumnya, tapi kira-kira kalau teman-teman membaca jadwal akan seperti ini. Misalkan, karena kalau teman-teman lihat jadwal itu selalu 5 hari kan. Misalkan wilayah Sumatera 28 April sampai 2 Mei, 5 hari. Hari pertama dan hari kelima kosong. Persiapan internal. Hari kedua dan ketiga prelims. 3 prelims each day. Hari keempat elim. Jadwal untuk perondanya akan diberikan jarak waktu untuk istirahat. Jadwal akan dibuat semanusiawi mungkin. Sorry, buat materialnya cuma ada PPT tech briefing, yang lain gimana? Do real life? Baru hari ini loh, baru hari ini slide, baru hari ini briefingnya. Kami berharap teman-teman memperhatikan terlebih dahulu sebelum meminta slide, agar tidak dibiasakan budaya minta slide. Thanks. check-in sehari sekali. Oke, ada pertanyaan yang bagus. The competition is with the same wilayah. For example, wilayah 1. Is it mean that we're gonna meet the other team from different LGT? Correct. Everyone can meet each other di dalam satu wilayah tersebut. Setelah 6 prelim selesai, tabulasi terpisah per LLBT akan dibuat. Sehingga teman-teman akan di-rank against fellow union from the same LLBT. We have to check in 5 days or only when we debating? Hanya waktu debat. What if the educator miss accepting the test? Nilai terendah akan diberikan. Apakah skor prelim akan mempengaruhi hasil di babak eliminasi? Tidak. Skor prelim hanya berpengaruh ke bracket. Akan melawan siapa di babak eliminasi. Oke, nah saya rasa itu pertanyaan yang sudah terakhir. For the final ranking, apakah debater di grade sebagai tim atau sebagai individual? Sebagai tim. Tapi akan ada speaker award juga. Oke. Saya rasa itu yang dapat saya presentasikan pada hari ini. Apabila ada pertanyaan, teman-teman dapat tanyakan di grup masing-masing. Akan ada salah satu dari saya ataupun Ilin yang akan menjawab. Saya berdoa hasil yang terbaik bagi teman-teman semua, terlepas dari hasil yang akan dicapai di seleksi wilayah kali ini. Kami harapkan teman-teman dapat mendapatkan sesuatu dari teman-teman dapatkan experience dari 6 babak pengisian tersebut. Teman-teman mendapatkan ilmu yang baru, teman-teman mendapatkan skill yang baru, teman-teman bisa bertanya kepada juri-juri dan belajar debat lebih lagi, karena lomba debat bukan hanya NUDC. Kami doakan yang terbaik. Apabila tidak ada pertanyaan lagi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Swastiastu, namo buddhaya, salam kebajikan, shalom.
Thank you Andre. Umar mungkin akan melanjutkan untuk menjelaskan judge test. Umar, deh.
Ya, halo Pak, thank you. Thank you, Pak Rahmat. Thank you, Andre. So, this should be the last part of the whole day, basically. Sorry. Don't mind that. All right. So in this part, what we're going to do is to share a little bit in terms of the judge test. What is the judge test? What you should do in the judge test and how it's going to be graded. Because it's unfortunate. Before we proceed, I would like to just point out that we have provided the judge briefings, we have provided the debate briefings, we have said things, a lot of things even, and then people ask questions related to debate and judge briefing and the TAC or TAP briefing that is completely unrelated. So now I hope that the N1 judges listen to this carefully. So we're going to walk you through in terms of the judge test, okay? So for the judge test, we are going to share a Google form link. So the link will be shared in the WhatsApp group, and we're going to find any other type of communication mode that we can share the Google form that will help you regardless. So that's number one. It will be through a Google form. Once you open the Google form, what you will see, let me just share screen. Give me a second. Sorry, give me a second. All right. Cool. So I hope everyone can see my screen. So this is how the judge accreditation will look like. Again, we are going to share this link later on. And then you can see that there is a description in terms of the judge test. Read this carefully because it should give a lot of instructions for how you're going to do the judge test. Okay. So first of all, this most important thing that you need to acknowledge is that it is officially going to be released today, but the deadline for your submission for the judge test is next week on April 23rd at 11:55 GMT plus 7. You might say, but it is H+2 Lebaran. Unfortunately, for all of you, Lebaran is still like technically 6 to 5 days to go, which means that you have 4 days at least before Eid starts. Yeah. So that means if you want to do it right away, it can be finished in 3 hours in just one sitting. If you want to nyicil, that's completely fine, but manage your time accordingly. We are not going to provide extensions because failing to complete the test by this deadline will result in you being a score of 0. And I need to re-emphasize this because we did mention this in the judge briefing, but some people asked this again on the TAP or TAC briefing, that your score will not determine whether or not you can compete in the tournament, but it will determine the status of your judging, right? It's either chair, it's either panel, or also trainee. It doesn't mean that chair is better than everyone else, not necessarily the case, but this test is to understand your basic understanding of BP debating as a judge and also as a debater. So that's why we provided hours of briefing for you to listen, which you should have listened as well, right? And then this judge test will be divided into 2 parts. The first part is multiple choices questions. For the multiple choices question, I need to emphasize that each question will only have one answer. So you don't need to worry like things like, but I think this is also correct. If you think that there are more than one correct answer, then one of them has to be wrong, okay? And then, unless of course jawabannya itu yang bentuknya yang benar adalah A, B, dan C, A dan B saja. So just make sure that you read the questions carefully, okay? Untuk multiple choices, there are 2 types of multiple choices. The first one, ada yang true or false, dan ada yang seperti biasa A, B, C, D, E, atau bisa lebih. Yang true or false artinya jawabannya ya pilihannya cuma 2, antara betul atau salah gitu ya. So answer accordingly. Yang satu lagi, just read the question and you're not asked to evaluate the statement. You're just finding the most correct answer out of the possible options. Contohnya kalau kita lihat, ya udah seperti ini. First question, nanti ada opsinya apa. Terus nanti true or false seperti apa. I'm not going to give you the hint sampai akhirnya kita officially release ya. Nah, in the form as well, you're going to be asked to share your name. Di sini make sure namanya adalah nama yang digunakan untuk pendaftaran. Jadi jangan sampai misalnya namanya siapa, tapi yang didaftarkan itu menggunakan nama apa, tapi di sini pakai nickname atau nama yang kita nggak bisa recognize, atau misalnya nama yang singkat. Contohnya namanya Muhammad bla bla bla, tapi ditaruh Muhammad aja. Kita tahu nama Muhammad banyak gitu ya. So please make sure that the name that you put here is the name that is used for the official registration. Second, tell us your institution or university. Ini penting because we are going to score you. We're going to analyze how many answers you got correct, right? So in that case, make sure that you did fill in the institution or university, right? Dan full ya, jangan singkatan. Ini udah dikasih contoh, jadi kalau ada singkatan, terus meskipun udah ditaruh contoh, then literate yourself, I guess. Nah, berikutnya, tell us the region you're registered in. Di sini udah kita jabarkan, region 1 ada apa aja, region 2 dan seterusnya, jadi jangan sampai salah. Kita bisa tetap cross-check, cuma lebih baik jika memang dari teman-teman sudah benar di awal, okay? So that's the basic administration processes for the judge test. cukup sign in, taruh email, nama, institution, dan region. After that, that's a judge test. Oke? Nah, kita balik lagi ke tipe judge test. Tadi ada dua, yaitu adalah si multiple choices dan exhibition debate, something that we have mentioned for quite some time in the previous briefings. In the test debate, ada link berikut di dalam formnya. Jadi kalau kalian belum sempat screenshot sekarang, nggak masalah, because we are going to provide that later in the form. So, and once you will need to click on the link, and then you're going to see the debate. You're going to watch the debate. It's an actual debate with actual people speaking, yang udah didesain for NUDC, right? And then what you need to do after watching the debate is that you're going to give the rankings, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4. After you give the rankings, what you need to do next is to give scores to each speaker. In terms of scoring, it is also already on the briefing deck that we're going to share as well. So do not worry. So you score the speakers, right? And remember, speaker score, if combined, will be a team score. Team score will decide who is the winner of this debate. Yeah. So for example, if I'm Prime Minister, I get 80 and Deputy Prime Minister gets 78. What is the team score? 158, right? And if, let's say, the other teams do not get 158 because they get lower in total, then opening government has to win the debate because the number or the total score is the highest. It doesn't make sense if you think opening government should win, but their total score is lesser than the other team's score, okay? We have received past submissions where people think that, okay, I give OG the first, but then in terms of total score, OG actually gets third. So I don't think that's how math is supposed to work. That's why then you need to make sure that the team that you actually give the win is actually the team with the highest score after you allocate and assign speaker scores based on the range that we have provided. So be careful. Secondly, in terms of scoring, also take note that there should be no tie. Gak ada seri, gak ada seri, gak ada skor yang sama. Team score, speaker score boleh sama. Contoh, Prime Minister, DPM, dua-duanya dapat 78, nggak apa-apa. Kalau memang mereka dalam range yang sama, sesuai dengan bracket ataupun dengan deskripsi yang sudah diberikan oleh Batara tadi di judge briefing. Oke? Nah, yang nggak boleh adalah Prime Minister 78, DPM 78, Leader Opposition 78, Deputy Leader Opposition 78. Ya, kalau gitu nggak ada yang menang antara OG sama OO. Ya. So what you need to do is to make sure that you score them, but there is an actual winning team based on the total score. Okay? I hope that's clear, and I hope this makes sense, because throughout the years, we have received where people say, again, tim yang menang ini, tapi skor mereka di bawah tim yang lain. Terus ada tim yang menang ini, tapi skornya seri atau sama dengan tim yang lain. Which means ya, yang nggak menang dong, kan gitu. So pay attention to that. And lastly, after you watch the debate, after you give your ranking, after you score the speakers, you're going to be sharing your recorded version of your oral adjudication. Oral adjudication is basically your reasoning of the debate, yeah? Of you explaining why this team get that ranking, why the other team get the other ranking. We have shared you in the briefing again, what is the ideal way of doing your or structuring your oral adjudication. It is in the judge briefing. We make sure that it's been covered. So you can try to incorporate or try to adopt that method in recording. As for the recording, I will scroll a little bit. So I'll just stop sharing. As for the recording, we only accept audio files. So no video recordings. Do not record it in the form of, I don't know, MP, is MP, yeah, technically, I believe MP4 is video. And then you do MP4 and then you record yourself talking. We don't need that. We just need your audio recording, because video recording, in that case, like your actual, like the whole video is on, it will be too much or too big for a size for us to actually handle the correction process simply. So that's why audio is enough. Audio, we also receive questions. Kak, nggak bisa nih upload gara-gara pakai apa namanya? Of course the video exists. We have uploaded it. Anyway, so Kak, audio nggak bisa nih, cuma aku formatnya M4A nggak bisa diupload. Kalau misalnya Google Formnya bilang cuma bisa upload MP3, ya udah convert. We're all resourceful adults, right? Well, like if you mention that what is, how are we supposed to debate about things that we don't know without Google, which means that you're good at Googling. So let's say the Google form does not accept M4A format, then be resourceful, try to look other ways how you can do that. You should be able to upload it in MP3 though, so you can change that format, okay? So that should be the judge test. And it's mandatory for all N1 educator, because it's mandatory, not because you cannot participate if you don't do the judge test. You can get a 0 if you don't do the judge test, and you still need to participate in the tournament, which means that you're going to be trainee. But if that is something that you don't want to do, remember, N1, if they do not show up in the tournament, aka if they're not committed to the tournament, it could affect the team eventually. So my suggestion, N1s, take this very seriously, because judging, I'm just going to share you a little bit. I've been judging for more than a decade now, and judging is one of my greatest joys. It doesn't have to be your greatest joy, but judging is fun. It's not as stressful as you think it would be, okay? So that's what you need to do. And if you have any questions, we are going to address them now. But it's already 4 p.m. Waktu Indonesia Barat, and I believe that some regions will have buka puasa as well. So we don't want to obviously delay the thing. So let's see some questions related to the judge test. Yeah, I will be quick about this. Is there a time limit for the audio? Yes, 10 minutes. Is it safe to say that it's permitted to do the multiple choice test and watch the debate on different day? Yes, up to you. Like, you can manage your own time, but we have calculated it takes 3 hours to finish everything. Okay, but yeah. Should you extend the test submission considering that day is Lebaran? I just told you Lebaran is still 5 days to go. You have 5 days to work on the judge test, which means that tomorrow it's still the 17th, belum cuti bersama, or the day after is Tuesday, 18th, belum cuti bersama. I believe cuti bersama is on the 19th. So technically you have tonight, tomorrow the whole day, and then Tuesday the whole day for you to work on the test. And we did mention you only take 3 hours. So if you want to procrastinate, go ahead, up to you. But we're not going to extend. Okay, next. Can we send the recording divided with the Google form? I'm not sure what the question is about, so please rephrase. Next question, I guess. If the N1 fail in doing the test or is not qualified to continue the disqualification stage, does it mean no? Like, the way N1 affect teams or debaters are if the N1s are not showing up. Okay, if the N1 does not qualify to continue, the team can still continue in the elimination rounds, and the other way around applies. If the N1 qualifies but the team doesn't qualify because they don't have enough points, then the N1 can still judge the elimination round. So it's good. There's no such failing on the test. Yeah, correct. Thank you so much for that. When they exactly schedule preliminary elimination round, I think you already asked Andre about this, and Andre has already mentioned that it's typically around the tournament, so we're not going to do it. I'm not going to be able to answer that now. When do we turn in the test? I literally said this in the earlier. I really hope that people were listening. I know it's fasting, and I'm also fasting, but I don't think it takes a lot to just specifically listen and also be, paying attention, basically. So the judge test is due on the 23rd, a week from now. Lebaran H+2 atau hari kedua Lebaran. You can do it today, tonight. We're going to release it soon. You can do it tomorrow. You can do it lusa, whenever. But a week is more than enough. Karena total waktu yang dibutuhkan untuk ngerjain judge test cuma 3 jam. Kalaupun kita nggak pakai hari ini, masih ada Senin, Selasa, itu aja udah ada 48 jam. 48 jam. Dan kalau cuma butuh 3 jam, dikit kok. We're not going to take a lot. If you want to cicil 1 hari 1 jam, silakan, nggak masalah. Yang penting seminggu. Okay? So yes, the link will be shared soon. Link yang akan di-share, judge briefing, debate briefing, dan judge test. Oke, di judge test udah termasuk tadi ya video debatnya sama instruksinya. Saran saya silakan dibaca lagi briefingnya karena briefingnya itu banyak kok pertanyaan-pertanyaan sesuai dengan briefingnya. Kita bukan bikin pertanyaan yang nggak ada materinya dimanapun. Kita fair kok. Jadi kalau nggak baca si briefing, silakan juga dibaca di pedoman yang ada di halaman 20 ke depan. Oke. Ya, harusnya sudah mulai masuk waktu buka puasa juga. Jadi terima kasih teman-teman buat yang sudah mendengarkan. If you have any question, silakan di direct ke grup. Saya juga eventually akan dapat akses dan bisa membantu menjawab. So thank you so much. Harusnya ini sudah penutupan. Mungkin saya bisa serahkan kembali ke pihak BPTI. Apakah MC Mbak Farah ada atau saya bisa langsung tutup aja nih, Pak Rahmat mungkin.
Bu Farah akan menutup acara ini. Thank you very much Omar and all CAP members.
Baik, thank you so much Pak Rahmat.
Silakan Bu Farah.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Pak Kerry, Bu Fonda, Pak Rahmat, Mbak Deta, Mbak Feliani, Mas Omar, Mas Hans, Mas Batara, Mas Andre, Mbak Ilen, Mas Fuad, and everyone for delivering your best efforts in making this seminar happen so smoothly today. We wouldn't have made NUDC 2023 without you all. So finally, let's Debat National University Debating Championship tahun 2023 pada sore hari ini. Semoga acara ini bermanfaat sebagai bekal rekan serta debaters and educators dalam mengikuti seluruh rangkaian tahapan dalam ajang NUDC tahun 2023. Atas nama panitia penyelenggara, kami sampaikan terima kasih. Mohon maaf sebesar-besarnya jika sekiranya ada ulah kata yang kurang berkenan di hati hadirin. Untuk menutup acara ini, marilah bersama-sama kita mengucapkan hamdalah. Alhamdulillahirrahmanirrahim. Selamat menunaikan ibadah puasa bagi yang menjalankan. Tetap semangat, meraih prestasi gemilang untuk kita semua. Atas nama Balai Pengembangan Talenta Indonesia, BPTI, Kementerian Pendidikan, Kebudayaan, Riset, dan Teknologi, izinkan kami menyampaikan harapan agar bersama kita dapat bangkit lebih kuat, pulih lebih cepat, dan berprestasi lebih hebat. Billahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.